Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone to the second session of our 2023 Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference virtual workshop series. Today's topic is carbon capture and sequestration, the myth and reality. These events are sponsored for us by the University of Alaska Fairbanks and the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. My name is Haley Payne. I am the Deputy Director at the Alaska Division of Oil and Gas, part of the Department of Natural Resources, and I'm really thrilled to be with you all today for this conversation. For me personally, I've been with the Division of Oil and Gas for 8 years now, and it has been fascinating to watch the evolution of this conversation from a topic that was sort of on the fringe and not really unpacked very deeply to one in the last 2 years that has really become the forefront of a lot of attention. I'd say for me, that big inflection point was December of 2021. Governor Dunleavy asked different actors in the state to get together in response to a request for information from the Department of Energy on carbon capture potential for the state. That RFI lovingly became known as the RFI that stole Christmas, as a number of folks ended up working quite a few hours over the holidays there. But nonetheless, it sort of began this conversation in earnest in the state where we looked around and realized that maybe this is something we should stay a little bit more on top of and track and come together on. From that point, the University of Alaska really took the lead in terms of starting a work group in the state that brought together those same actors from the RFI. And today, that conversation has really just taken to that next level. With the introduction of legislation discussing CCUS that's actually been put before the legislature. So hopefully today we can kind of continue that conversation on and bring together the different experts around the world in order to learn from them and also ask them our questions and really understand what's happening around the globe and is there a place for it in the state, and if so, what does that look like? So thank you all. Just for a little bit of background information on these workshops. This is the second in a series of 3 virtual workshops. These are being held monthly as a part of a 2 half-day Zoom conferences that are free of charge leading up to the conference to ensure that we can do a deeper dive on those topics that maybe require a little bit more than just that 1 hour that you get in a panel discussion. And so this is that opportunity. Coming up next month, we do also have energy storage beyond lithium-ion batteries. And then this culminates with the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference, May 22nd through the 25th. In all of these cases, the goal is really to bring together folks to continue on this conversation and ensure that we're asking all the questions that we need to for that robust participation in the conference itself. Luckily, recordings of all of these workshops will be available at the Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference website, which is www.alaskasustainableenergy.com. So looking forward to our time together today, I just want to pull up the agenda and let everyone know what we're going to be up to. So again, we're just kicking off with our welcome here now, and then we're going to hit our first line of speakers. We're going to be lucky enough today to have Carbon Capture, Utilization, and Storage 101 brought to us by the Global CCS Institute. We'll then kind of take that macro level where we're going to become familiar with the terms and really start to unpack what is the policy around CCUS. What are we looking at on a national stage in terms of decarbonization? From that point, we're going to transition into some discussions that will lay some more groundwork for terminology, including in the geology for CCUS, the business case, and also a little bit about the carbon capture technology itself. Finally, we'll get to wrap up and talk to one of the regulators from another state, North Dakota, who's actually been moving forward with these projects and can give us a little sneak peek of what we may expect or what it is we want to make sure we take into account for. And so that's our day 1 agenda. I'm lucky enough to be your MC, but I will have other folks joining me as well who will be serving as moderators for the individual panelists. Looking ahead to day 2 tomorrow morning, we will have Frank Pascavan serving as the MC for this discussion. He's going to walk us through, and again, we have a lot of great moderators set up. Day 2 is really going to focus on a lot of those project specifics where we're going to get to look at those opportunities that are currently in development around the world or those projects that we have to learn from. And then we want to bring that back to the Alaska context and really start to land on what are the opportunities here in Alaska and what sort of parallels or related projects do we have that we can look at as a template for examples of what we could expect here. So that's just giving you a little sense of what all is coming up. And also there's the opportunity during all of our panelist discussions for Q&A. Everyone's going to speak for roughly about 20 minutes or 15. And please make sure and use your chat section there to enter in those questions, because that's really what the heart of this is getting those questions answered. So we'll be keeping an eye on that chat and then bringing those at the wrap up at the end of each presentation. So that was a lot of information to get started with. Maybe we can go ahead and get started with a little bit of an engagement poll. So this is going to check if your caffeine levels are fully in. Also, we'd just like to see, where is everyone in the room at, and where are kind of our standings at this point in time. So from your computer, please join us at slido.com. And there's the hashtag 2699585 is our meeting code. I'll also give you a minute. You can scan the QR code, and that's going to bring up Slido. Slido is a really fun tool to be able to use to do live interactive polling in real time. Had a lot of fun using it myself at different company meetings, important questions like what's your favorite candy? But we'll get into something a little more carbon capture related today with our engagement polls. So hopefully everybody has a chance to kind of get logged into there and see the opportunities for that. And so I think we'll go ahead and get that first question on the screen, but then just allow a little bit of extra time here for folks that are just sort of getting logged in. So first question, how would you characterize your understanding of carbon capture, utilization, and storage? We have a few different options here. We have, I know a little bit about it, but I'm here to learn more, which is already off to an early lead. I am well versed in CCUS and feel comfortable discussing the topic. This is a new topic for me, or I am an expert. So we'll just kind of see if these start to scroll in here. And it's really great to see that we have folks that know a little bit, but are here to learn more, because that's really ultimately the point of that. I do appreciate that no one has gone so far as to say they're an expert. I'm not sure I would qualify myself in that category either, but I definitely am here to learn some more and feel, okay, now we did have an expert chime in, of course. So maybe they can be one of our panelists as well, so we can learn from them. We've got about 52 folks who registered in. We'll give it just one more second here. But I think, what's kind of interesting to see about this poll, and something that's not surprising about the topic in general, is this is maybe something we've heard a little bit more about, but there's still a lot to learn. While CCUS has been around for a few decades, the advancement in it and the development in it is really starting to take off and take flight. We've got a good number of folks in here. We'll be able to ask some of these questions again at the end of this, and hopefully anybody for who this was a new topic is going to be able to kind of change that position on there. So maybe let's move on to our next engagement poll here and see. Okay, so our second question, which should be live up on your phone or computer as well, are what are your thoughts about CCUS activities taking place in Alaska? Would you consider yourself either supportive? This could be an exciting new opportunity for the state's economy and environment. Mixed, there could be some positive applications, but some uncertainty exists. Undecided, do not know enough about it yet to decide either way. Or opposed, this seems like it's hard to read them when they keep bouncing. It seems like a dangerous idea, and I do not want to see it in Alaska. So we've got about half the folks that participated in the first question have so far logged in. So we'll kind of see where those votes keep coming back up. Definitely a little bit of a mixed bag on this one as well. And I think that's really important. Hopefully for those who are undecided, this offers an opportunity to learn a bit more. And certainly, it's important to recognize that there's discussions on all sides of this. And so hopefully today we can address those questions for those who are supportive and those who are opposed and have concerns. And that's really the point of this exercise today. So we'll give it just about one more minute. I'm seeing a lot of support out there. About half of the voters have put that in there, but necessarily a lot of mixed impressions, just like any sort of new energy technology. All right, well, I think we'll close voting on this poll. Again, it'll be fun to sort of take a view at the end of this and see where that all ends up. Our last engagement poll is going to be beyond multiple choice. So this is going to be a word cloud. And in this word cloud, I'd love to know what brought you here today, and as simple as one word or a couple of word phrase. What is that topic that is of most interest to you? Are you here to learn more about the geology? Are you here to learn more about the technology? Are you here to learn about specific projects and other locations? how is the community engagement taken on? Economics, how does the dollars and cents for this work out? So what the word cloud is structured as is that every time a vote goes in there, it'll pop up. And then as folks begin to put the same point down as in economics, you see it start to grow and grow and grow. And so that gives us a really great sense of sort of where everyone is at on this. Some of the other words that we're seeing are technology and regulatory, research, efficacy, business models sort of related to the economics there. Geology itself, Alaska. Yeah, we definitely want to get into the Alaska context for this topic as well. Permit bottlenecks. Okay. Still have 9 participants typing. Hopefully we get a few more out of those, but safety, certainly a big concern that can tie into the regulations themselves. Opposite viewpoints, always important to actually continue on in a discourse around any topic. Industry options, more industry use, maybe some of the applications for utilization on this. I think most of our speakers are going to be focused on the actual storage applications, but certainly this is a topic that could be spent more than just 2 half days on. So hopefully we'll get a little glimpse of some of those usages. And then I do see about 4 more folks still typing. So I want to give them all an opportunity to continue on that. I do see forestry up there. And certainly biological sequestration is a component of the general discussion on carbon storage. Here today, and as our 101 speaker will be getting into, we're really focused on geologic storage. But the applications for this in terms of forestry is another huge market that is a big topic of discussion, especially in the legislature as well. I'm going to give those last 2 folks just a second to finish putting in their words, and then we'll move on from that. And hopefully we can bring these sort of ideas back up again later and test and see where we ended up with that. Let's see, climate, ethics, leakage, safety. Great. So it looks like we're here for a long-term liability. We've got a vast footprint of topics here, and I'm really excited to hear what all of our different speakers are going to say in response to this. All right, well, I think we'll put Slido to the side for now and go ahead and pick back up. So we have a few housekeeping items. We have about 100 folks online now, which is really exciting. And maybe if you wouldn't mind just putting yourself in the chat as well. Maybe introduce yourself, state what organization you're representing, or if you're just a citizen, a member of the public, a university student. It'd just be great to see who all's out there and understand who's joining the conversation today. So feel free to use the chat. The chat is also going to be sort of your portal to being able to do questions and answers as well. During the workshop, all attendees are going to be muted, but you may submit questions or comments using the chat feature. We do also have chat support available. So some folks are kind of behind the scenes. If you have any questions, you're experiencing any technical difficulties, so you can just let them know if you're having any audio or troubles. They are linked as chat support. And so they're available to assist you and make sure all this gets to run smoothly. And again, as mentioned before, this is a recorded workshop. And so it'll be recorded and available again live at alaskasustainableenergy.com for a later date for those of us who couldn't quite dedicate the whole half day this morning. Really nice to see folks introducing themselves in the chat. It looks like we have a number of different entities and persons represented. So thank you all for signing in and keep the conversation going in that chat today. So as we're moving into this, just wanted to go ahead and get us kicked off with some welcome remarks from Governor Mike Dunleavy. He's bringing us a special message to talk about this workshop today. Governor Dunleavy is also the architect for our Sustainable Energy Conference and has really been instrumental in helping ensure that we get these workshops off the ground. So with that, I'll kick it over to our governor for the introductory remarks.
Good morning, and thanks for joining this pre-event workshop for the 2nd Annual Alaska Sustainable Energy Conference. For the next 2 days, you'll hear from experts regarding carbon capture, utilization, and storage, also referred to as CCUS, one of the most promising technologies toward achieving decarbonization. These workshops will work through the myths and realities of carbon storage by engaging with actors within and outside the state who bring real-world project experience to this new conversation for Alaska. CCUS in Alaska represents a tremendous opportunity. It's an opportunity to move into the future by creating sustainable pathways for existing industries, an opportunity to grow an entirely new industry, and an opportunity to elevate the state's reputation as a responsible area of the world for alternative resource development. In Alaska, we're blessed with the resources of today, and we're also blessed with the resources of tomorrow. The ability to capture and store carbon by geological sequestration is an opportunity we must consider and pursue. Alaska's older oil and gas basins, particularly in Cook Inlet and the North Slope, have prime geological pore space to sequester carbon dioxide underground. While much work is yet to be done, we can also imagine the exciting possibilities for our interior region and its abundant coal resources. I want you to consider not only how CCUS will change the world's carbon emissions, but also the investment that'll come to Alaska with its carbon storage capacity. It's also important to note that this doesn't displace oil and gas in Alaska. Alaska is big enough to be able to provide all kinds of opportunities. Alaska is not an either-or place. We are endowed with resources in many forms. In fact, having a robust CCUS industry in Alaska will actually make us more attractive to investors and new projects. My administration recognizes the demand set by corporate goals and objectives to achieve net zero carbon emission standards and to design new developments in line with those objectives. CCUS can provide that opportunity. Additionally, it allows companies to be more financially diverse and the mechanisms they select to reach those net zero goals. Thank you for taking the time to discuss and learn about this emerging market and new opportunity for Alaska. I know you'll gain a better, broader understanding about the myths and realities of CCUS. Enjoy the workshop, and I hope to see you in person at the Sustainable Energy Conference in Anchorage, Alaska, May 22nd through the 25th. Have a great day.
Great. Thank you all for tuning in. So next, I'd like to transition over to Gwen Holdman. She is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, Innovation, and Industry Partnerships at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. She's also served as the former director of ASEP, whom I was fortunate enough at one point to be able to serve as a research assistant and student intern for. So I'd like to thank Gwen for that opportunity. ASEP and the rest of the team at UAF are really on the forefront of finding those unique advantages or opportunities or challenges that we have here in the energy sector in Alaska, and looking around the world for where can we find the lessons to improve our own energy systems, as well as where do we have that opportunity to export our expertise and actually market ourselves as really the cutting edge for that. So I'd like to thank Gwen and all of the researchers at ASEP for the work they do and for putting on this conference today. So thank you so much, Gwen. Welcome.
Thanks, Haley. And it's so exciting to see some of our former interns in positions like you. I've had really lucky to get to work with you personally when you were at the university. And so it's just great to see so many of our students that are doing work that's really relevant to the future of the state. So I'd really like to commend you, especially for the time that you've taken with developing this workshop agenda, both you and Frank. Thanks to the Department of Environment, to all of your staff, because you guys have really done a really great job of helping pull together a really amazing agenda for this. You mentioned my title as this new Associate Vice Chancellor. I'm really working on trying to see how the university can work more closely with industry, with our communities in these kinds of emerging areas of interest. As the founding director of the Alaska Center for Energy and Power, we're also really interested in making sure that we're creating opportunities for sort of sharing of information, of emerging technology areas that are relevant to Alaska. This workshop is one example of that. And I'll admit that this is actually a workshop that I personally was advocating for, because this is an area that I myself want to learn a little bit more about. And I was really glad to see in that poll that we sort of have a pretty diverse group of Alaskans, it looks like here, that have different sort of baseline perspectives and different levels of knowledge kind of coming into this workshop. And that's exactly what we're looking for here. Our goal is really to bring together not just advocates and proponents, but really have an opportunity to sort of have a diverse conversation and bring different perspectives to the table so that we can kind of come away from this with a little bit more of a nuanced, informed position on these different kinds of technologies that are relevant to us in the future. So anyway, I really appreciate everyone that's taking the time to be here today. Please let other folks know about this workshop if there's folks that you think could really benefit from being here today. And I encourage you to ask hard questions. We'll have plenty of opportunity for dialogue with our speakers. Like I said, we have an amazing panel of speakers both today and tomorrow. And thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks, Haley.
Yes, thank you so much, Gwen. Really appreciate that introduction, and as well that positioning that we do want to get to some tough questions that, we want to identify where are those myths, where are those realities, and where are those uncertainties. So really important to ensure that this is a balanced conversation. So thanks for that note. Well, at this point in time, we're going to go ahead and dive right in and introduce our first speaker today. So our first speaker will be presenting to us on carbon capture, utilization, and storage 101. We have with us Ruth Ivory Moore. She is the Policy and Advocacy Manager for Americas of the Global CCS Institute. At the Global CCS Institute, she is responsible for delivering the Institute's advocacy strategy to ensure maximum impact for accelerating the deployment of CCS as a vital technology and an integral part of net zero emissions futures. Before joining Global CCS Institute, Ruth spent 20 plus years at ExxonMobil Corporation in various engineering, legal, and commercial roles across the upstream, refining, and chemical divisions. After leaving ExxonMobil, Ruth was Program Director for the Environmental and Corporate Social Responsibility for the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, where her focus was addressing all facets of international climate change matters, ESG, and shareholder advocacy. Ruth holds a Bachelor of Science in Chemical Engineering from Howard University and a Master's of Science in Chemical Engineering from Ohio State University and a law degree from Rutgers University. Thank you so much, Ruth. We're really excited to have you here today and way to kick us off on the right foot.
Thank you, Haley. Thanks a lot for being here, for inviting me to be here today. And I'm very excited about talking about this topic. While I was at ExxonMobil, I was the CCS attorney, and so I helped to ExxonMobil become actually a member of the Institute. So this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. But again, thank you. Thanks, everybody, for joining, and thanks for just the interest that Alaska is showing in CCS. As Haley said, that I am the Policy and Advocacy Manager for the Americas for the Global CCS Institute. Today, I'm going to only give literally a 101, and I'm going to talk primarily at a very high level. Other presenters will take much more of a deeper dive into the various topics of CCS. So, but first, I'd like to just give you a little bit of information about the Global CCS Institute. We are a global think tank. We're headquartered in Melbourne, Australia. We have a global team that works around the world with offices around the world. And we have a very narrow focus versus other think tanks, and that our support is really geared to the deployment of CCS. And that tells you how important we see CCS, and that we know based on reports from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and IEA reports that we really can't get to net zero without with a mitigation tool like CCS. So that's what our issue, that's what we advocate for, and that's what we're pushing for. We have a diverse membership. We have government members. We have industry, large, small industry. We also have some academics. We spend most of our time advocating for CCS and developing public available thought leadership pieces to help with policy advocacy and to help with the understanding of CCS. We understand that this is a new technology for some, even though it's been around for about 50 plus years, but it is new in the minds of some. But then the next thing I'd like to do is just go a little bit over the why for CCS. What is CCS? CCS is the value chain. What we're seeing is that the value chain includes three processes. You have the capture, transport, and also you have the storage portion of CCS. And the whole point of that is that under the CC, we're looking at the storage, we're looking at the capture. And this is what we call point source capture. We're usually capturing the CO2 that is from a gas stream, typically a post-combustion gas stream. Once the material is captured, then the CO2 is treated, dehydrated, and compressed, and then is transported from away from the capture plant to via pipeline, truck, or by ship. And another form of capture is called direct air capture. We also know that in order to reach net zero, we have to also take care of those legacy emissions that exist in the atmosphere. And that's where the technology like direct air capture comes in. And in this technology, CO2 is removed directly from the atmosphere at ambient concentrations. Then the S part of CCS stands for storage or sequestration. This is where the CO2 is typically injected deep into ground for geological sequestration or for use for enhanced oil recovery. I won't get into the geology, but I do want to bring up the term, which you may hear a lot, of pore space. Pore space is the discrete void within the rocks, which contain normally air, water, or other hydrocarbon fluids, but this is where the CO2 is injected. And in sequestering CO2, you'll find that it's not, it creates other concerns. It brings up, there are a number of issues that can come up. One is who has the ownership right of the pore space. And today in 20 minutes, you don't have time to get into all those minute details, but just understand that within the U.S., there are different owners, different theories of who owns the surface and the mineral rights in the pore space. So then why CCS? CCS is important because in achieving decarbonization in hard to decarbonized sectors, it is extremely important. It is important to enable the production of low carbon hydrogen, which is seen as a potential another fuel, and providing carbon dispatchable power, and also for delivering negative emissions. There are some sectors where the only way you can reach net zero based on today's current technology is by looking at by utilizing CCS. And I will address the elephant that may be in the room now by saying that there are a lot of and with any technology, there are a lot of different theories or statements about it. And there have been statements made where CCS is mainly for the proliferation of oil and gas. That's not true. We need to have oil and gas to make sure that we transition to a net zero future. But in addition to that, CCS is really necessary to decarbonize those hard to decarbonize sectors. This diagram shows the intersection, how the demand for CCS intersects. You have a demand from an economic perspective. We need to have a just transition from reliance on fossil fuel to more of the renewable energy. We have a demand for greenhouse gas emission reduction. In order to get to a low carbon footprint, lower energy, we need to make sure we have that. And CCS is sort of like that brings all these things together. And again, just emphasizing, as the demand for energy, fertilizer, steel, cement, and chemicals continue, CCS is that technology that's going to be critical for making sure that we can meet those goals that we need to meet in order to make sure that we meet the goals that are set by the Paris Agreement and the goals that we need to set to make sure that we leave an environment for the next generation. CCS, we now need to move from ambition to action. Where we are now, we know what our goals are reaching 2030. We know we need to be 50% below 2005 greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And by 2050, we need to reach net zero. What we're seeing now that there's tremendous uptick in the demand for CCS. We're seeing that in a number of different entities, we're seeing that demand has just accelerated at a pace that's really almost unheard of before. First, the private sector's response for getting there is also increasing. The capture capacity in projects in the pipeline is now well over 280 million tons per year and growing. Policy and funding in our sectors from North America, the EU, and even Asia Pac, we're seeing continued growth there. But despite the progress we're seeing today, we still need to make sure we're still not at the pace or the scale we need for full deployment of CCS. But I do want to show you a diagram which shows what the pipeline looks like. The chart shows that if you look at from 2010 until now, you're seeing the growth. The lighter red area shows what's operational now. This is a global picture. The darker red shows what's in construction now. And then when you start looking at the blues, you're seeing the advancement and the development of CCS projects. And then when you go to the lighter blue, we'll see what's in early development. And you can see that there was sort of a tail off going into like the mid-teens, 2015, 2017. But now we're seeing a tremendous uptick in the CCS itself, deployment, and also the operation. There are significant development that we've seen in the past 12 months over the year. 2 years ago, we were not there, but we've seen now the closer we get to 2030, the closer that entities realize that we have to use this as one of many mitigation tools. We're seeing that a lot needs to be done. So we're seeing that there are 4 new facilities that enter operation in 2022. In the U.S., we had the Red Trail Energy Project in North Dakota. We had a Canada project, Glacier Glass plant in Canada. We also had a project in Iceland, and we had a petrochemical project in China. There are additional projects that are being planned and implemented in Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, the United Kingdom, and also in Iceland. And what we're seeing now is that if you look at a global map of looking at the operating facilities, right now you're seeing that most of the facilities are located in the US and Canada. So US and Canada are leading the way. There are 13 facilities in operation in the US and 5 operating in Canada. Globally, there are 32 facilities in operation, with 18 in the Americas, 13 in the US, and 5 in Canada. Europe is hosting 4, with 2 in Norway, 1 in Hungary, and 1 in Iceland. China hosts 5 facilities. Brazil, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and UAE and Australia each host 1 facility. This map is going to be changed rapidly, though, over the next few years. You're going to see that the deployment of CCS is going to increase significantly as time goes on. One thing the Institute does, and I would advise, hope that you would also subscribe to or look at this. This is a public-facing document. On an annual basis, we produce what we call the global status of CCS. And by producing this, you will get a feel for how fast that CCS is progressing. And so that there will be a link in the slides that you'll be able to get. We're starting to work on 2023 now, and that will be released during the end of the year. But in the document, it not only talks about policy, it talks about operations, it talks about new technologies. So it's a good document to refer to as you're trying to understand where CCS is at this moment. One reason for the significant uptake in CCS is that there has been a significant amount of policy and legislation that has been implemented. And I'm just going to right now focus primarily on the U.S. In late 2021 and in 2022, we saw the U.S. implement significant pieces of legislation, exactly historic level of funding for climate change in general, but also for CCS or CCUS. In late 2021, the U.S. passed the bipartisan infrastructure law, and that gave the Department of Energy significant funding for a number of different projects. There were over $6.5 billion in new carbon management funding for over 5 years. And a lot of that is for direct air capture and for carbon dioxide storage. You have the deployment of an additional $11.5 billion related to activity related to carbon capture pilot projects, regional direct air capture hubs, DAC, and I'll just say DAC going forward, DAC, technology prize competition, carbon capture technology, different storage validation and testing program, utilization program. The newly created Office of Clean Energy Demonstration was allocated $3.5 billion for carbon capture technology. So the bipartisan infrastructure law was a significant bill to help to jumpstart the U.S. in the carbon capture technology area and also in other clean energy. Then in August of 2022, they passed Congress and President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act. That contained a significant provision that was an IRS provision, which provides what they call tax credit for CCUS projects. And by doing that, it's not new. 45Q came into existence around 2008. But what this did, it provided significant enhancement to spur the production or spur the implementation and deployment of CCUS. It extended the start of construction date and increased the funding or the credit that entities would be allowed to take for that. And it also had a note related to environmental justice also. In all the projects, this administration, the Biden administration, has made environmental justice to be a significant part of all the work that's being done. Those communities who have been historically impacted now, in everything that's done, the environmental justice aspect is taken into consideration. Also, another area that relates to the storage of CO2 is what you'll hear called Class 6 wells. Under this federal Safe Drinking Water Act, the act is geared toward or mandated to protect drinking water supplies, groundwater supplies. So to store CO2, they added a new class called Class 6. Right now, EPA has the authority for permitting Class 6. 2 states have been granted the permission to do that. You have to go through an approval process to do that, an approval application. Those two, and it's called primacy. Those 2 states are North Dakota, and also Wyoming. They have primacy to do that, so they can implement the permits. In addition to that, a number of states have permits in for EPA for review. Louisiana, based on words that we've seen in public media, should have its review done by EPA fairly soon, but then you're going to a notice and comment period, and then you will have to go, there may be opportunities for hearings then too. But the bottom line is that there are about 40 some odd projects that are headed to EPA, and the time for getting permits issued is fairly slow. And so it needs to be a way to speed that up, and by states getting primacy to be able to permit those wells themselves provides a lot of, will help to expedite the process. Anyway, to make sure that things are safe, in order to get a Class 6 well permit, you must identify how you're going to monitor. There are certain monitoring requirements that must be done. EPA provides significant guidance on how to do that. And then we have the CEQ, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, announced members of 2 new task forces that will provide input to inform the responsible development of CCUS. The task forces have just been named, and they're waiting to see what their true commission will be, and should be starting to work fairly soon. So where we are right now is that realizing CCS is scaled globally, we still need to do that. We need to make sure that we define the role of CCS in meeting the national climate strategies. We need to create long-term and high-value storage on the carbon dioxide. We need to support the identification and appraisal of geological storage resources. We need to develop specific CCS laws and regulations. Right now, the technology in some cases like particularly in permitting, has exceeded what some of the regulatory regimes have come to. We need to identify opportunities for CCS networks to facilitate the establishment of transport and storage structure. Hubs is becoming a big deal now, and we need to enable investment in CCS through appropriate policy and also funding mechanism. And with that, I will take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ruth. We really appreciate you getting us started off here with some of those 101s covering that entire value chain for us, as well as some of those terms that may be coming up later here. I heard, pore space, sort of documenting, what are those holes in the microscopic grains of sand there, as well as class 6. So that's going to be our injection well guiding for CO2 storage. We've got a couple of questions in the chat, and then I have a few more. So folks, if you have questions that you would like to ask, please feel free to put them in the chat group, and we'll be sure and bring them up as well. So one comment that maybe kind of lends itself to a question is, is carbon capture and storage a transition technology, meaning one that we only utilize insofar as we sort of transition off fossil fuels, or is this a part of a sort of longer term sort of solution in terms of decarbonization? So maybe if you could touch a little bit on the timing, is this a technology for an interim period, or is this a technology and a methodology that you see as being a long-term sort of program and effort?
I'm probably going to give you a lawyer answer and say it depends, unfortunately. But carbon right now in the immediate near-term future, and I said immediate near-term future, getting to 2050, we can't get there without CCS and carbon capture and storage. But also, what I was not able to get into was that as part of the funding from a lot of the legislation, not only the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, the federal government is funding research and development for utilization of carbon dioxide. So I really can't, I don't have a crystal ball to say how long this is going to be, but to get to where we need to get to in the short term, to 2050, 2030 to 2050, we have to use these technologies, use carbon capture and storage. Now, at some point, also what will come into play would be nature-based solutions, utilization of the forest. So you need all these tools in the warehouse. And DOE is looking at, and also the federal government is looking at everything. So right now, it is sort of transition because we can't meet the net zero unless we do have CCS as part of as a mitigation tool. But down the road, the government is looking at a lot of different options. So I think CCS will be around for a long time because it's going to take a long time for any of these new technologies to take hold.
Yeah, thank you for that. And so, with that in mind, you also brought up some great points about sort of the uptick that we've seen, the increased number of projects. Could you maybe sort of categorize or frame that uptick in number of projects or development into the relative scale of maybe sort of where it's envisioned to go? If we've seen, 40 new projects coming on, is that a big number? Is that something that we can expect to kind of see plateau, or would we anticipate maybe continued exponential growth? If you can maybe kind of land that within, the near term to long term.
I think we're going to see exponential growth because even with the new projects that are coming on, we still are only scraping the bottom of the barrel. We're not where we need to be to get to the level of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is needed. So it's not just, the carbon dioxide is produced, but we also need to be able to take out those legacy carbon dioxide emissions too. So addressing carbon dioxide is going to be key. You're also going to hear a lot about methane, addressing methane too. But addressing carbon dioxide is going to be key, and it's going to have to be an exponential in the storage. We need more pipeline to be able to transport it. So we need an exponential also how it's transported. So we don't see any leveling off. It's only going to increase the need for it.
And along with that, you referenced earlier some harder to abate sort of technologies. I think steel and cement were thrown on there. Could you maybe explain just at a high level, why we consider those hard to abate, or why CCS is particularly relevant to those? If there's any sort of, expansion on why that's sort of a critical pathway for specific heavy industries.
For one thing, we need steel, we need cement, and the way right now, the technology of the way the facilities operate, we don't really have a way of capturing or abating the carbon dioxide is in an economic way. The carbon dioxide is produced from these type of facilities. So capturing it from that point source will be the only way to get there based on the technology today that we have and based on the technology for the future. But with that said, there are entities, again, research and development is key. And as part of the legislation, there are entities that are looking at doing some things that will do a different job, but it is still involved CCS. So for the foreseeable future, we don't see right now another technological solution but to deploy CCS. We will continue to need to build buildings. We will continue to need to build roads. So the demand in our lifestyle for cement and steel and even fertilizer plants will continue. So we don't see that right now with the technology that we have, there really is nothing other than CCS that can get us there to capture those emissions.
Great. Yeah, thank you. That sort of helps to kind of land why that's such a targeted sector for heavy industry. We've got a few different comments in the chat, some that I think we'll also be able to bring back up when we have Dr. David Lepane, our state geologist, on, who can get more into the specifics of the geology of Alaska. But I think broadly speaking, there are some really good sort of thoughts or questions. What are some of the risks with underground storage, and how can they be managed? What are some of the things in that regulatory environment that are really kind of keeping an eye for that total containment, if there's anything you can speak to there?
Yeah, when siting is done for geological storage, and again, I'm not a geologist, so I know you're going to go into this more detail, but when a siting is done, they're looking at the geology of that area, and they're looking at that rock structure, that rock formation, and what they're looking for is to make sure that when the CO2 is there, that it will remain there. Now, I know there have been some concern, and that's why I think it's really key to understand that the Class 6 well that is used for sequestering the CO2 is really coming under the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. So as part of a Class 6 well application, you have to demonstrate to EPA or to whatever the permitting entity is, as more state game primacy to be able to implement those, that you have a sufficient monitoring technique in place, that you have accountability, and that you have verification. So from a technological perspective and a geological perspective, you put it in rock formation, you put it in areas that the CO2 will remain there for thousands of years. But again, I'm not a geologist, so I can't give you the exact geological name. But as part of your permit application and as a part of the permit issuance, you have to specify how you're going to do the monitoring, reporting, and verification, because you will have to check. And one way to do this is to check to see if you have any leakage. That will have to be part of that too. So to protect the underground drinking water, you will have to demonstrate in the permit that you have a process that can do that.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, obviously one of the things that you need to focus on in your permitting and regulatory environment is preventing any risk of leakage, and that the protection of our underwater drinking sources is sort of the focus of the whole UIC program. And exactly. For those on the line, as indicated before, we'll have Dr. David Lepane up a little bit later today to talk about Alaska geology. And then at the end of the day today, we'll have the opportunity to talk to one of the regulators out in North Dakota who is permitting these projects currently, and can maybe unpack with more permitting specificity what are some of those risks that they're looking to address and mitigate against in terms of the permitting process. So certainly a conversation I think will come up repeatedly throughout a lot of speakers today. If I might transition a little bit to a regulatory question, you made a comment about how our technology is moving forward, and sometimes it could be advancing more rapidly than the regulatory environment in general, and that there is this need to ensure at a national, international, statewide level that we have a cohesive framework in place. You also referenced the White House's Council for Environmental Quality Task Force, of which you've recently been named a member. And so, as I understand it, you all will be focusing on, what are sort of those recommendations and policy and regulatory needs that need to be accounted for. Could you share a little bit personally about what some of your priorities or the priorities of the Global CCS Institute is going into that council?
Yeah, I think, I'm so happy. I feel honored to be appointed to that task force. And the whole purpose of the task force aligns perfectly with what we're trying to do in the Institute. It includes looking at permitting. How do we permit in an efficient manner? Right now, one of the bottlenecks in deployment is permitting. But when you issue a permit, you got to make sure that you reflect the needs and the inputs of a wide range of constituents, stakeholders. And you need to be able to deliver the benefits rather than make sure they don't harm local communities. So our mission is at the Institute, and I believe where we're going, we've been named, but we have not been commissioned yet. But the whole purpose of this is to be able to advise and recommend to the federal government on how to ensure that CCUS projects are deployed safely and economically in a manner such that we will be able to meet our goals and also be able to make sure that communities are protected, where all aspects, whether you're talking about the storage or you're talking about the pipelines, because we'll be looking at the entire CCS chain from the point of capture to the transport to also to the storage. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that stakeholders are involved and that they are consulted and that they understand what is happening here.
Great. And so another question that came up in chat, just to see if you'd like to touch on here. So most of the CCS in operation today, at least historically in the US, has been used for enhanced oil recovery. When you're doing enhanced oil recovery using CO2, does that involve actual permanent storage of the CO2? I believe there is some inclusion in the Infrastructure Act that you referenced for credits towards that. So can you talk about whether enhanced oil recovery sort of intersects with geologic storage in any sort of permanent way?
Yeah, it does. And I know that there are a lot of EOR, enhanced oil recovery, does have some adverse considerations there are adverse opinions on what it does. But EOR is a way of you're using the CO2, yes, to increase the production of your oil, but you're also including that CO2 in the oil. So it is a way of storing. And if you look at the bipartisan, the Inflation Reduction Act, you do get a credit for EOR, but the credit is not as much as it is for storage. So there is the legislation or the bill, the law is leaning more toward permanent storage because you do get more of a credit for permanent storage. But storage in the rock, I'll put it that way, as opposed to just for EOR.
Great. So maybe it's fair to characterize it sort of as a byproduct of enhanced oil recovery. Some of that CO2 is remaining stored underground, but not to the extent that something that would be pure sequestration. Right. There's not a production component associated with it.
Right.
Okay, great. And again, maybe we can unpack that in a little bit more detail as we get into some of the geology talks. Mm-hmm. But thanks also for noting that those different credit amounts and that the infrastructure bill is anticipating incentivizing those different technologies based on sort of either their readiness or ability to capture the CO2.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Inflation Reduction Act is the one who's actually looking at providing the credits. Yes.
So kind of to transition again, you've talked a lot about sort of, community outreach and stakeholder engagement. So as we're imagining these projects sort of moving forward, potentially throughout the U.S. and the permitting of those, can you talk a little bit about, what does that look like? Where is that kind of build in for the community and stakeholder engagement? Is that a requirement? And just sort of where is that in terms of the overall, policy potentially moving forward on the development of these projects?
Yeah. If you're getting a grant of funding from the Department of Energy, you have to put together what they call the DEIA plan. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and access plan, which is actually going to you have to demonstrate to them how you're including the representation of people, of communities in these type of projects. If to be successful, number one, philosophy, my point is that we need CCS to get to net zero, but we can't deploy CCS if we don't have buy-in from the public and also from investors. So they come hand in hand. So when a project is being planned, community engagement cannot be seen as a second thought. It has to be a thought you have to be proactive. And then recognizing that communities are different. They're not monolithic. So there has to be a conscious effort to be engaging with communities. Just to give an example, there may be, by engaging with communities, you may get a better understanding of what the real concerns are. It may be that people just really don't understand what CO2 happens to be. A lot of times when you talk about gas in a pipeline, you think of something like H2 as hydrogen sulfide, but CO2 is non-toxic. It's been transported for 50 years, and it's a safe way of doing it to be a pipeline. But in order to get any technology, and CCS is a technology, over that hurdle, you have to have buy-in from the communities. So making sure that you're engaging with the communities, that companies are going, just like when they go in to approve a project from a financial perspective, every I is dotted and every T is crossed. The same thing has to be with communities, and recognizing that if I'm going to a community in a suburb of New Orleans, that's different from going to a community in rural Iowa or in some place in, San Joaquin Valley in California. And that just creates quite a complexity and a challenge, but it's a challenge that has to be overcome, and that we have to make sure that the community concerns are heard and that they are explained and acted upon. So I can't emphasize enough being proactive, engagement, education, and most importantly, listening to what communities have to say.
Well, I want to say thank you so much, Ruth, for joining us today. It's really been wonderful to have you. And you referenced that the Global CCS Institute has a report that they've updated annually. Are there any other resources or anything that you wanted to kind of highlight for folks kind of interested in learning more, or directing them to as we kind of wind up this first session here?
Yes, visit our website. We have a number of thought leadership pieces. One is coming out on actually the hard to decarbonize sector. It should be next month. They'll talk more about cement steel. So we have thought leadership pieces or insight pieces coming up very soon on lots of that. We'll also be developing resources on pipelines. I saw that in the question, there was a question in the chat about pipelines. So we will be looking to develop resources on pipelines and what needs to be done to help with the deployment of pipelines and the hubs, which are key. But yeah, go to our website and you will find lots of public documents there of thought leadership on various aspects of carbon capture storage.
Great. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate your time this morning and for joining us. And have a wonderful day. And thanks for being a part of our conversation.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, Well, thanks for the participation in that first round. As you can see, whenever you put things in the chat, we are going to be able to bring those up and ask them to the speakers. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that opportunity. Now I'd like to transition into our next presentation, and our next moderator for that presentation is Jeremy Casper. He is currently the director for UAS Alaska Center for Energy and Power, and has also been instrumental in terms of co-directing and founding the Pacific Marine Energy Center, which is a leading U.S. consortium of marine energy research institutes with the Department of Energy and National Marine Renewable Energy Center. So welcome, Jeremy, and thank you for being a moderator here today.
Thank you very much, Haley. So as your moderator, I'll do my very best to keep track of the questions that you can put in the chat there for us. And please do not be afraid to ask the tough questions, because that's really the role that we see here for ACEP. We want to facilitate the discussion. We're not cheerleading one particular solution over another. We really want to have the focus on the dialogue and get the information out. And as Haley mentioned right at the start there with the poll, a lot of us are not experts here, and I am in that category for sure. I know a very little about carbon capture, utilization, storage, and I'm here to learn more. With that, I have the pleasure of introducing our next speaker, Laura Brennan. Laura is a senior policy advisor and federal climate policy lead for the Nature Conservancy, based in Arlington, Virginia, where she steers the Conservancy's strategy to advance U.S. federal climate and energy policies, putting the U.S. on a path to achieve net zero by 2050. Laura joined the Conservancy from the energy industry, where she worked in public affairs and government relations for 2 separate oil and gas multinationals. Before that, Laura was with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a nonpartisan foreign policy think tank in the DC area, where she analyzed global strategic trends. In her 2 decades in Washington, Laura's covered a wide range of climate, energy, and environmental policy issues, including their intersection with trade and national security, and has engaged in legislative, regulatory, administrative, and broader stakeholder engagement processes. Similar to Ruth, Laura was recently appointed to a White House task force, this one on carbon dioxide capture, utilization, and storage for non-federal lands and permitting. Today, Laura will be talking with us about CCUS at an inflection point. And again, please put your questions in the chat. And if you guys don't have questions, I'll try and ask the hard questions too. But with that, I'll hand it off to Laura. Thanks, Laura.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. Hopefully not too hard questions. So let me actually start, after that very kind personal introduction, let me start by introducing the Nature Conservancy. We are a global conservation organization with a singular mission: conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. Just a small task that we've set for ourselves. We have chapters in all 50 states, and our work extends across the globe into 79 countries and territories. In Alaska, the Nature Conservancy in Alaska has offices in Anchorage and Juneau, staffed by 20 of my wonderful colleagues. I sit on a central team directing our engagement on climate change across the United States. So from where I sit, I can offer a high-level national perspective on the opportunities and challenges associated with deploying carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or CCUS, across the United States. Having worked in the energy and tracked these types of issues for a long, long time, I recognize that energy and environmental opportunities and challenges in Alaska are unique. And so it's possible that not everything I say or I share today may be applicable to your great state of Alaska, but I hope my comments will at least provide some useful framing for thinking about the future of CCUS in Alaska. So I wanted to really start today by explaining why a global conservation organization like the Nature Conservancy supports or sees a role for carbon capture, utilization, and storage in the fight against climate change. And we really see that we are at an historic inflection point in this country when it comes to CCUS. We're about to move, as Ruth mentioned, we're really moving from this period of kind of theoretical policymaking to real pragmatic on-the-ground action. We're going to start seeing steel in the ground and more projects being put into place. So as we see that shift, That also requires a shift in the types of questions that are asked, the types of information that's gathered, and the types of considerations and practices employed. And so I'll start today by, again, talking a little bit about why a global conservation organization like TNC supports or is supportive of this inflection point and kind of moving into this implementation phase, but then explore a little bit more about what our outlook on CCUS deployment and the main, what we're seeing as driving that deployment, before finally touching on the important project level considerations for ensuring that this expansion benefits both people and nature. What's really important to take away is that, we see CCUS as part of a suite of climate solutions needed to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It's not a panacea. It's not the best solution in all instances, but it is does play an important role in getting us to net zero. And as we start this kind of massive build out of carbon capture and the associated infrastructure, it really means that the choices that we are going to make today and that are going to be made in the coming months and years will set precedents that will reverberate over the coming decades. It'll shape our community experiences, the environmental impacts, and the different pathways, and our pathway to reaching net zero. So let me begin by exploring a little bit more the role of CCUS in the pathway to net zero, and I think Ruth covered a lot of this already, so I can hopefully be a little bit brief in this part of my remarks. But from the role that CCUS plays in the pathway to net zero is the primary reason that the Nature Conservancy is supportive of this technology and has been engaging in the policies that Ruth mentioned that have just been put in place and kind of supportive of that general policy framework. So as an organization that relies on science-based collaborative approach, the Nature Conservancy believes that the science is clear that climate change poses a significant threat to our communities, our economy, and to nature itself. And that is why we must address climate change right now. Our best chance to limit the worst impacts of climate change is to ensure that by 2050, we have reached net zero carbon emissions, both in the United States and around the world. And this will require significant decarbonization of our global economy. We have years, not decades, to act. And this is the foundation of how we view CCUS in the context of decarbonization and the fight against climate change. In the United States, the transition to the clean energy economy is already underway, but we still need to significantly increase the pace of that transition. We must first reduce and avoid emissions and greenhouse gases, which entails a rapid and thoughtful deployment of renewables and other zero-emitting energy to power our homes, drive our cars, and run our factories. I know we're focusing mostly on engineered carbon sequestration today, but our farms and forests will also play an important role in the pathway to net zero. Up to a fifth of the emissions reductions we need in the US can be achieved by using natural climate solutions, land use practices that increase the amount of carbon stored in forests, wetlands, and soils. Alongside these important climate solutions, carbon management technologies are important tools in the suite of approaches we need to rapidly deploy to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. There's a lot of modeling and analysis that supports that role. The International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, analysis shows that utilizing carbon capture technology is vital to meeting our climate goals. The IPCC's most recent report, in the IPCC's most recent report, 6 of the 7 scenarios they evaluated required carbon capture in order to limit temperature rises to under 2 degrees Celsius. And this is something that Ruth has already mentioned too. TNC has undertaken our own analysis. We're interested in looking at in decarbonization pathways what some of the potential implications for conservation and land use requirements may be. And so this past August, we released a report called the Power of Place West, in which we analyzed pathways for meeting economy-wide energy demand in 11 Western interconnected states. So how do we get ourselves to net zero? But by also get ourselves to net zero, but also meet energy demand and kind of optimize for nature and communities. And the optimal decarbonization pathway in that study finds for both climate and conservation takes advantage of all of the commercially available clean energy technologies, including CCUS, to achieve that 2050 climate goal. So what we found is that by relying on a mix of clean energy options, again, including carbon capture and storage, we can use less land, limit costs, require less transmission, and we increase the likelihood of successfully accelerating the rate of construction of clean energy infrastructure by mid-century. That last study was done on those 11 Western states. In a couple of weeks, we're going to release an updated study that will look at the lower 48 states, and we'll have similar conclusions. So the modeling is very clear. Or the modeling and analysis across the board is pretty clear, both that we've done and that others have done, that there is a role for CCUS in achieving net zero. And across all of those models and across all of that analysis, the use case for CCUS usually focuses on three things. The first is almost universal to all of the analysis and modeling. So the first use case is tackling emissions in sectors with limited technological alternatives. So as was already mentioned, industries like cement, chemicals, iron, and steel that create materials central to our modern way of life require high heat processes and produce hard to abate process emissions. So there are just some chemical processes in that manufacturing process that also emit greenhouse gases. And there's very few alternatives, technological alternatives that will meet those types of heat requirements or those types of chemical process requirements that do not result in greenhouse gas emissions. And so for these industries with few carbon mitigation options, the best case least cost option is for capturing and sequestering those emissions, and that's what makes CCUS a critical climate solution for those industries. The IEA projects that carbon capture can contribute nearly 1/5 of industrial sector emission reductions needed for those types of industries. The other two use cases that we commonly see across all of these different models and analysis are vary a little bit more across the different studies. And it depends a lot on factors like cost of the technology, cost of other alternatives, expectations for the policy environment, a lot of different things. So the second use case is retrofitting existing power and industrial plants, meaning those plants that have already been built today or that are already in existence today or are going to be built in the near future and are going to extend and whose natural working life kind of extends into the period where we need them to be operating on a net zero basis. And for those facilities where, but for CCUS, they would be emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. Carbon capture offers a cost-effective climate solution to avoid those emissions contributing to climate change. The third use case is balancing emissions that are unavoidable or technologically difficult to abate by combining CCUS with bioenergy specifically, or enabling least cost, low carbon hydrogen production. And so for some emission sources like aviation or long haul trucking or even some other industrial emissions, low or zero carbon drop-in fuels may be the least cost technologically feasible option. But for those fuels to truly be net zero, And for them to be true climate solutions, you have to consider the entire life cycle emissions of those fuels. And in order to kind of lower that life cycle emission, carbon capture and sequestration paired with the manufacturing of the fuel can lower that overall life cycle calculation. There are a lot of moving pieces in that, and the cumulative climate benefits will depend on a number of factors. And so, and that's where you start to see a lot of the variability in that use case across the different models. But still, from these modeling exercises, it is clear that carbon capture, utilization, and storage can play an integral role among a suite of climate solutions needed to reduce emissions and avoid the worst impacts of climate change. It's not the silver bullet, but it is an important tool in the toolbox. Pragmatic applications of carbon capture, utilization, and storage strategies must be deployed as soon as possible, with a high priority placed on achieving net emissions reductions from sectors that are not likely to be abated or do not have the technically feasible alternatives. And that's really where TNC tries to put our priority, is in making sure that these technologies are available to address those specific emissions. And as been mentioned, or as I mentioned previously, we've been very active in supporting the policies to promote the development and deployment of CCUS. And as a country, you know, we're appreciative of all of the recent policies that Congress has put in place over the last 2 years. But we're really moving from this period where you know, the policy is being put into practice and that deployment is becoming a reality. According to, and I know there were questions before about some of the numbers, of that expansion and the rapid expansion. So I'll offer a couple more examples or a couple more statistics. According to records kept by the Clean Air Task Force, 113 carbon capture projects have been announced in the United States alone since the beginning of 2021. 17 of those projects have been announced since the beginning of this year, so just the last 4 months. And in models of the effects of some of these recent policies that have been put in place, the tax credits alone could increase the annual investments of carbon capture up to 13 times in 2030, higher in 2030 than they will be, or than they are today. So we're about to see this massive growth. And we're clearly on this upward trajectory of carbon capture in this country, which makes it more important than ever to carefully consider how best to ensure that CCUS is responsibly scaled in a way that maintains the integrity of public health, the environment, and the economy. So if we want to think a little bit more deeply about how to ensure this transition to net zero and deploy carbon management technologies in a careful and thoughtful way, we need to start thinking about the processes. We need to start thinking about the processes that those projects are going to be deployed, and kind of where and how they will be deployed. So there's the point of capture itself, where the carbon or the greenhouse gases will be captured, where they will be stored, the storage wells are sequestered, and there again, permanent storage is the ideal. And then there's the pipelines that will connect the two, or the transportation requirements between those two. There are currently about 5,000 miles of carbon dioxide transport pipelines in the United States, and some projections suggest that over 29,000 miles of pipelines will be needed in the coming decade. So as this demand increases and we connect these points of carbon capture with the points of storage, it's essential that we prioritize protection of natural and cultural resources and ensure robust community engagement and tribal consultation when siting these projects. In the Alaska context, that means recognizing tribes, village corporations, and regional corporations as important stakeholders, rights holders, and landowners, and pursue early, ongoing, and consistent consultation. Smart from the start land use planning will also help ensure CCUS is deployed with as little impact as possible to natural lands, cultural resources, recreation, and conservation. Maximizing the use of the current built environment, including existing extraction, pipeline, electrical, and transportation infrastructure corridors, is one strategy for minimizing disruption to these valuable lands. The concerns and potential impacts to communities that have historically experienced the worst impacts of pollution are essential considerations in citing specific projects and broader deployment of carbon management technologies. In evaluating opportunities to deploy CCUS, it is important to consider societal net benefits. So as we look at each of these projects individually and as a whole, taking into account the societal net benefits is important. This includes not only the atmospheric impacts, but also impacts on local air pollutants and other factors that local communities, stakeholders, and tribes are positioned to identify. Significant, and in this context, significant and ongoing community consultation will help ensure that communities near the facilities do not experience harm related to the deployment of the technology. To be effective, federal and state agencies responsible for approving carbon management projects will need adequate sustained staffing and resourcing for robust community engagement and efficient permitting. For example, a recent Princeton Net Zero America study found that the U.S. will need to invest $13 billion by 2035 for stakeholder engagement, site characterization, and permitting to ensure sufficient geologic sequestration sites are available for rapid deployment of carbon capture technologies. Time is really of the essence when it comes to climate action. We must act now to secure a future for our planet and generations that will come after us, and we must do so using all of the solutions at our disposal, including carbon capture, utilization, and storage. The recent federal policies are helping to drive forward that investment in the technology and the supporting infrastructure. At this critical juncture, it is important to engage in forward-looking planning and develop best practices that will ensure CCUS is prioritized for the hardest to abate sectors without technically feasible alternatives, and to ensure that it's deployed in a way that benefits both people and nature. Federal state agency coordination, thoughtful planning, and early, effective, and consistent ongoing stakeholder engagement will help ensure these solutions are available at the scale and within the time frame we need them. With that, I will conclude, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. So I was keeping track of questions in the chat there, but I'll start off with some ones that I think you mostly answered, but we'll circle back and just make sure folks got the answers they wanted or needed. One question about how would CO2 get to Alaska? Plans for pipelines from the states or some other method?
I think that this is where kind of the broad planning comes in, and the importance of kind of zooming out and thinking carefully about where the demand centers will be and where the opportunities are for that sequestration. In the lower 48, in the continental U.S., there's that there are significant industrial centers, but there are also available sequestration geologies in pretty close proximity. So I wouldn't envision there being any kind of pipeline from Joliet, Indiana, all the way up to Alaska. But there could be some more localized use cases in Alaska that could be looked at.
Great, thanks. One question here about CO2 and the role of atmospheric CO2 and the role that plants could play in that removal. Recognizing that an enriched CO2 atmosphere enhances plant growth, do you see indoor farming as a potential role in utilizing some of that CO2? What might the scale look like that would be required there?
That's an interesting concept, and not one that I've seen any modeling or analysis on. But I think it does bring up an interesting question of the U in CCUS and the utilization. There are a lot of this is an emerging area of discussion, especially in the policy space, because so much of the focus to date has been more on permanent storage and sequestration. There hasn't been as much conversation around utilization and some of the things that need to be thought about in designing policies or in other or in deploying utilization are kind of the permanence. And by utilization, what I mean is taking the CO2 and incorporating it into a physical product. So that could be cement, it could be plastics, it could be fuels. There are a lot of options there. I would put kind of utilization of CO2 or incorporating CO2 into kind of an indoor farming type of operation into that utilization bucket. Although again, not one that I've seen a lot of research on. But some of the factors, some of the considerations in looking at utilization are kind of the permanence. So how long would that CO2 be embedded in that product? How do you account for that CO2? So how do you actually calculate the CO2 embodied in that product? And then kind of from a policy perspective, the point of, you could call it the point of regulation, but who is getting the benefit of whether it's a tax incentive or a requirement, whether it's a carrot or a stick type of policy, who's on the hook to prove that they've actually done that capture and utilization.
So taking a little bit of a step back, both you and Ruth talked about siting of CO2 projects, but in order to site CO2 projects, you're going to have to start thinking about stakeholder engagement. Any thoughts on what effective stakeholder engagement looks like for these types of projects? Yeah.
So I think it will depend on what part of the value chain you're talking about. So if we're talking about the capture, and again, in TNC's, from TNC's perspective, we concentrate mostly on the use case where carbon capture is being incorporated into industrial facilities or into kind of fixed facilities where they don't have a lot of alternatives for a zero carbon fuel or a renewable energy wouldn't quite fit the bill for whatever it is that they're for their operations. And so if you think about that kind of fixed facility and incorporating carbon capture into it, there's going to be a big, there will necessarily be a significant kind of community engagement piece with the communities directly adjacent to that facility. And then when you're talking about kind of the pipeline infrastructure or the transport infrastructure from the point of capture to the point of sequestration, that's a much larger scale, and there's a whole other kind of permitting and stakeholder engagement process involved, and that's where you start getting into some of the tribal considerations, some of the landowner considerations, and it becomes even more important to start that engagement early, both in the kind of site, even as the project is kind of being conceptualized, and the siting of that pipeline is starting to take shape.
Okay, thanks, Laura. We're right at 10 o'clock, so we're going to hand it back over to Haley. Thank you very much, Laura.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Jeremy. Really appreciate that conversation. So we're going to get ready and transition into our next speakers who are going to be talking to us more about the capture portion of that value chain. And we get to take a look at a particular technology that's out there. Again, we're kind of moving from that macro and policy level and international status now into like this deeper dive of specific subject matter. So joining us today, we're very pleased to have Vikram Arya and Ashish Patel. They're both coming to us from Carbon Clean. Vikram has spent 24 years in the energy sector, working with majors such as Shell and BP on the downstream side, both in B2B and B2C domains in operation, consulting, strategy, and techno-commercial roles. Joining him as well, we also have Ashish, who is a chemical engineer by trade. He has also worked in the oil and gas industry for about 15 years, and working in carbon capture industry is, as he says, very close to my heart, and I believe that protecting our planet is very essential for a sustainable future. So thank you both for joining us today and being willing to share with us a little bit more about this particular aspect of the value chain. And with that, I'll just let you take it away, and thank you so much again.
Thank you, Holly, for the wonderful introduction. I would like to thank all the panelists and attendees for giving us the opportunity to share some of the path-breaking and disruptive work that we have been doing at Carbon Clean. So I'll try to keep it simple, and the presentation is going to be followed by a Q&A session. Okay, so Carbon Clean. As most of you may know, International Energy Agency has declared that if we as a planet have to remain within 1.5 degree Celsius temperature escalation of the planet, we have to go from capturing roughly about 40 million tons, and that's 2020 data, to about 5 billion tons by 2050. And now that's a tall order. And for that to happen, or if we are to come anywhere close to that objective, I believe all the stakeholders, be it the industry, the technology providers, or the governments, have to really step up. Some of the impediments that have typically prevented industry to go in for a CCUS project historically, one is cost. So traditionally, the cost of carbon capture has been pretty steep. And second is space. Now that is something that's not normally realized in the public by the common people, that in legacy industrial site that's already up and running, there's hardly any space. So where do you put up this carbon capture plant? So we try to address both of these aspects. So I'll tell you something about the company. So Carbon Clean was founded in 2009 in London, England, by two engineers, and we have raised about $200 million in different rounds of funding so far. So as of today, we are at about 110 people. I believe 102 out of that number is engineers based out of London, Houston, and an office in Asia. So far, we have captured about 1.86 million tons of carbon dioxide through our various facilities that are in operation. We have been granted 98 patents globally for our process and some of the products. The USP of Carbon Clean is the 50% reduction in cost. So when we say 50%, it includes both capital expenditure and operational expenditure. Very small mass transfer equipment, and the amount of space that is required for a Carbon Clean carbon capture plant is less than half, which is which can be fairly big for a traditional amine-based carbon capture plant. As of April of 2023, we have 49 sites in operation globally, but primarily most of them are in Europe, a few in Asia, and as we speak, we will be commissioning one of our first plants here in North America. So as far as the process is concerned, this is a fairly generic process. It's been around for about 20 years. So I'll give you a high-level overview of the process. So you have the absorber section on the left side, and you have the stripper section on the right side. The flue gas, and that the source could be anything. The flue gas comes in from one side, passes through a heat exchanger and a blower, gets into the absorber section. The solvent, which is our proprietary amine promoted buffer solvent comes in from the other side, reacts with the flue gas, locks in the carbon dioxide. The flue gas then is released to the atmosphere, and the rich solvent then goes out at the bottom of the absorber section, gets into the stripper section where carbon dioxide is released and is captured, is sent for sequestration or dehydration or compression, or whichever way the client is set up. The lean solvent is then goes through a regen process in a reboiler and gets back into the absorber section. So this is kind of a 20,000 foot view of the process. What is unique in this process is our solvent, for which we have the global patent. So it requires very less solvent makeup. So just to elaborate on that point, a traditional amine would require about 1 to 1.2 kilograms of solvent for every ton of carbon capture. The APBA solvent requires about 310 grams, and that has a direct binding on your operational expenditure. This is also, very less energy intensive and hardly any hazardous emissions. So as I speak to you in April of 2023, we have 3 different suites of solutions available. One is the conventional technology. Now, this is the solution which is primarily geared for very large emitters. So you're talking of 1 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions. In this suite, we offer a license, basic engineering package, and solvent supplies. The second solution is the CDR Max, which is a prefabricated semi-modular system and is meant for small to medium-sized companies, those that have emissions in the range of 10 to 3 tons per day. So you're talking of 4,000 tons per annum to about 120,000 tons per annum of carbon dioxide emission. This is, one of the very interesting aspects of this solution is quick turnaround time. So you're looking at, from the time the client places an order, 16 to 22 months for the plant to be delivered. However, the most disruptive and path-breaking solution that we will be making commercial by end of second quarter of this year, 2023, is the Cyclone CC technology. This would be available in 10, 100, and 3 tons per day of carbon dioxide emissions, and will result in up to 50% reduction in both capital expenditure and operational expenditure. So this Cyclone CC is a combination of 2 intensification technologies, rotating packed bed, which is that gray disc that you see inside this blue colored contraption, and our APBA solvent. This is 100% modular and scalable, so a client can decide to deploy multiple modules of different capacities. In fact, I'm currently speaking to a very large midstream company here in Canada that plans to deploy 4 different modules, staggered over a particular period of time. So, by the way, this module that you see on the screen is a 1 ton per day module, and is one of the world's smallest carbon capture module in existence. It's in operation in Scotland. On the right side of the slide, you see what you see is fully integrated carbon capture module that is in operation at National Carbon Capture Center in Birmingham, Alabama. And as you can see, the total footprint of the module is less than that of a flatbed trailer. I've already emphasized the 50% reduction in the real estate that is required, and 50% reduction in both CapEx and OpEx as compared to the traditional amine plants. So just to kind of illustrate that point, what you see in the background is a 100 tons per day traditional carbon capture plant that can be fairly large and would have columns as high as 35 meters. And in the foreground is our Cyclone CC 100 tons per day that is roughly 26 by 8.6 meters and is 16 meters tall. So this overall shrinkage of space is actually more than 50%. So we've been deploying commercially across the world. So and this was one of our first commercial deployments. This was in Asia. This was a chemical and a fertilizer plant, 60,000 tons per annum. The flue gas came from a coal-fired furnace, And this actually was a great illustration of a circular carbon economy. The captured carbon dioxide was turned into soda ash and was sold to a company called Unilever, which is one of the world's biggest CPG companies. The capture percentage was more than 90%, and the cost of the particular plant in question that was achieved was $40 per ton. That was lowest in the world at that time. This was at a steel plant in Asia, and as you can see, this particular module in blue has a vertical orientation. Space was a big problem. This is a very old steel plant. We commissioned this in 2021, 5 tons per day. The flue gas came from a blast furnace, and the captured gas was used as a process gas within the plant. And prior to this, they used to actually buy carbon dioxide. This is the Cemex cement plant in Rüdersdorf, Germany, and this is going to be one of our flagship projects. We have completed the feed on this one. They will start with a 100 tons per day module. Then they will scale up to 400 tons per day and finally 2,000 tons per day. So this is going to be about 750,000 tons per annum carbon capture plant. Cemex has decided to deploy different modules over a certain number of years. And this also speaks to the modularity and scalability of the technology. And this will make this particular plant the first carbon neutral plant, cement plant in the world. We recently, about 7.5 weeks ago, signed a contract with Ørsted, which is a Swedish company. The project is Flagship 1. And this will be the first commercial green methanol project in the world. And they are in partnership with Liquid Wind of Norway, and Carbon Clean is the lead contractor and technology provider for this project. And we'll be supplying carbon capture equipment that will be able to capture 70,000 tons of biogenic carbon dioxide. And we are really excited about this one. Eventually, we also plan to offer carbon capture of the whole value chain as a service. So this is right now, at a conceptual stage, but the plan is to offer this, wherein all the activities, so right from capture to, whether it's reuse or sequestration, is offered, on a turnkey basis. So this is our operational map. As I said, we are present primarily in Europe, but also in Asia and North America. So across sectors, so you have steel, cement, chemicals, biomethane upgradation in Europe. We are also doing natural gas compressors in the US. So we're doing a project with Chevron in California that is going to be 120 tons per day. And I'm also in the process of commissioning one of the first pilot projects here in Canada. A list of some of our clients and our investment partners, and some of these names you might be able to recognize. And interestingly, some of the investors actually have turned into our customers also. I've already mentioned Cemex in Germany. There's also Veolia in Sheffield, UK, which is 10 tons per day, and it is energy from waste. So natural gas, energy from waste, cement. We are present in almost, I wouldn't say all, but most of the hard to abate industries. So why Carbon Clean? I believe we bring to the table scalable modular technology that is delivered on the ground, and we are expanding as I speak. And I believe we as a planet cannot afford to postpone this any longer. And all of us have to be proactive. And if companies are thinking about it, they need to hurry up, because I foresee a scenario whereby by 2027, 2028, there is going to be a huge demand. A lot of companies would like to get on board, but that's going to be a challenge for all of us. So that brings me to the end of my presentation. And yeah, questions?
All right, wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Vikram. Really exciting to hear about, the technology you all are working on. So I do have a couple questions, and I see some have started to populate here in the chat. So maybe my first one will kind of lead into one of these chat ones here. You've referenced that, part of what Carbon Clean is really focused on is sort of lowering that cost of capture. When we're imagining that sort of, value chain, as it were, between your capture, your transportation and storage, was there kind of like an industry standard or some metrics to say sort of what percentage of the cost of your project is going to have to be dedicated to each of those sort of components? Like, your capture eats up 60% of your project budget and your transport's 30, and so I don't know if you have sort of any feel to kind of let folks know, like, where does that capture component fit in terms of that whole sort of suite?
Great question, Haley. Unfortunately, there are so many moving pieces to this answer, because an operation could be X number of miles from the nearest, pipeline, or the grid of carbon capture pipelines that we are planning to roll out. When I say we, the industry wants to roll out. So depending upon that, and then what percentage of carbon dioxide do you have in your flue gas, and then what's the utility cost? So there are so many moving pieces, but roughly what I would say is that if the client wants to sequester and they have a license and access to a Class 6 well, fantastic. One of the challenges, and I think one of the earlier panelists, touched on that point. One of the challenges in certain geographies is going to be availability of certain geology that would, help, or that would help with the sequestration. So it's a very challenging question, but what I will say is that of all the projects that we have done globally, in Europe, there's a huge amount of emphasis on circular economy, so usage, because all of us know Europe is not a very vast piece of land, and their geology definitely is not that helpful. So there is a huge emphasis on utilization. One data point that I'd like to mention is that the CO2 that our plant is able to capture is 99.5% pure. So, one possible question can that be used as a food grade carbon dioxide? Because what we have seen in last 24 months, huge escalation in food grade CO2 prices in North America, which is kind of odd, there's so much demand. Now, definitely this CO2 that is captured in our plant would needs to be conditioned, because food grade, there are very stringent, regulatory guidelines for food grade CO2. So, it could be used there. So there is demand. But I think back to your question as to what percentage, it's kind of difficult for me to answer, because there are so many, as I said, so many moving pieces. But as companies, move forward in their journey and engage, they will come to know that certain technology providers can offer this technology at cost X, and then if you talk to us, then you might come in for a surprise. Let me just say that. Yeah.
And maybe perhaps to that point, maybe it's the concentration of the CO2 in which your sources can sort of necessarily impact some of those economics as well.
Absolutely.
So this may be a great question, maybe even more challenging than my percentage one. So when, we're imagining the cost of capturing all of the CO2 in the world right now with the sort of available technology, any indication on sort of what that scale or cost would be to actually reach those emission reduction goals?
Great question, actually. And I saw a question which was posed to one of the earlier panelists that what about the CO2 that's required for the plant? Now, in my limited exposure to this field, and it's been about 6 months, there is no way, at least the way I see things now globally, there is no way that we'll be able to come anywhere near that target, and that's not good. And the reason is there is just not enough capacity. So even if all the companies involved in this domain were to operate at 100% capacity right from today, there is no way, unless some, $100 billion, $200 billion investment takes place, even then, that we'll be able to capture, anywhere close to 5 billion tons of CO2 that we are trying to do, or we're trying to target. So the investment, what kind of investment would be required? I mean, you're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. But I think all of us in our own small way can actually force companies to, opt for ways to reduce their carbon footprint. Like if you buy an airline ticket in Europe, it actually comes with the data that your travel from Boston to Paris is going to result in so many kilograms of CO2, whatever, but yeah, I mean, you're talking of hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that would be required. But I'm glad to say that some governments proactively are taking steps to address those things, and the IRA that's been passed and the recently passed by the US government is a huge step. And I think that'll encourage governments around the world to kind of take proactive steps. And we've already seen that in Canada. But the budget came out less than 4 weeks ago, and there was a substantial amount of investment, budgetary allocation that was made. So, I'm optimistic, but I think still a lot more needs to be done.
And so in terms of that investment and looking at that value chain and how those percentages shift, is it, in your opinion, almost, is it necessary? I mean, maybe the most efficient, but is it necessary for co-location to be where your source and your sink are, or are there opportunities at the cost of capture and transport now maybe do they have to be co-located, or is there opportunities to sort of move CO2 to storage locations?
Great question. I'd like to say that no, it's not necessary. I mean, if it's economically viable for the company or for the entity in question to, transport it, and there is an opportunity to trade it, or maybe process it in certain way, use it as a raw material in cement or in a food processing industry, by all means. Because when we look at North America, there are going to be certain geographies where the companies are perfectly placed, like Gold Coast, some industry in the coastal region of Texas, Gulf Coast. Great, but somebody in Iowa or I don't know, may or may not be close to a facility that can help either sequester, and transporting it may not be economically viable. So I guess we'll be able to address these questions as we come closer to it, or we move on this path. But I think in some ways, how governments, provincial and state governments and the federal government help support this initiative would actually play a part. So something that was economically not viable 2 years ago has now suddenly become viable. So I think once dust settles and we know more about it, and as companies approach the governments for, grants and supports, some of those, I would hope a large number of those projects would become economically viable.
So really sort of at that inflection point, I think, as one of our previous speakers alluded to, where you're really sort of looking for the investment in the R&D to kind of transition these over into more economically stable models into a continued space, and not be as reliant potentially on some of the upfront R&D that we're seeing today.
I think research and development is a ongoing process. So although, as I said in my course of my presentation, we have I believe 96 patents, and I'm told now, I don't know if I'm supposed to quote it, an equal number is in the pipeline. So I think research and development is an ongoing process. No company, however big or small, can rest on its laurels. And if the cost of capture, both capex and opex, is, let's say, $45 US per ton, we have a corporate mandate. We would like to bring it down to $30 US per ton. That will be one of the lowest in the world. And that how that will happen? That would have to be by a more efficient process, more efficient solvent. I'd like to ask Ashish because he's the process engineer and he's much more conversant with the research and development aspects of it, how technology can help. So Ashish, would you like to weigh in on this? If this is an ongoing,
Yeah, sure. Vikram, at Carbon Clean, one of our primary objective is to make the project as economically feasible and producing the right amount of capture of CO2. Now, as Vikram mentioned in his presentation, the advantages of the rotating packing beds is obviously it uses the process intensification process. where we use the centrifugal force, which gives us a lot of advantages. It enforces better mass and heat transfer between the liquid and the gas phases through thinner liquid films. Again, centrifugal force would be responsible for it. It can generate more intense turbulent flows relative to the conventional columns. And as Vikram said, it results in smaller equipment sizes, resulting in less space requirement. One of the key part of our product is the solvent. As Vikram said, the technology we use is the APPS, which provides the benefits of fast reaction kinetics and low heat regeneration. This solvent has a higher CO2 loading capacity compared to the benchmark solvents like MEA. This results in lower circulation rate, so basically lowers the OPEX. And it has demonstrated to remove CO2 even at low concentrations with minimal solvent losses. So to echo what Vikram said, our products, our technology is directed towards making a project more feasible and producing the efficient capture of CO2.
Thanks, Ashish.
Yeah, thank you. So we have a few different questions in the chat that are really interested in the gas turbine, the Chevron gas turbine project that you referenced. So here in Alaska, the majority of our CO2 emissions are from gas turbines, particularly operating on the North Slope. So for those of us, interested in capture here in the state, necessarily sort of understanding, what that does to performance and how that impacts economics of those projects is really key. So there's a few different questions. Maybe I'll just read those off and then kind of allow you guys to jump in on that. So we have what is the target percentage capture rate for the Chevron gas turbine project? And building on this question, what is this expected impact to turbine performance? And then finally, a third component is what is the anticipated levelized cost of capture for the Chevron project? Is this a DOE grant project as well? So lots to talk about there, and I'll let you all jump in.
That's a great set of questions. So interestingly, not only the Chevron project, but I would say 90% of the companies that I'm engaged in consist of midstream companies that have either a natural gas pipeline, natural gas compressor station, gathering and processing plants and whatnot. So this is, so as far as I'm concerned, in Canada and even for most part of North America, a substantial chunk, that's going to be a low CO2 concentration flue gas. So we are talking of 3%. To 5.5, 6, 7, 8%. And our technology can handle. In fact, as I said, one of the earliest pilots that I'm commissioning, the client has a natural gas compressor station, and the CO2 percentage is 3.4%. Now, specifically to the Chevron, I'm not exposed to the entire details of the project. We are in the advanced engineering design stage. Whether there's any DOE funding or not, I am not clear, but I guess, I don't know. Ashish, do you know, is there any DOE funding for that project? Because I'm not aware. And as for the cost, I mean, that's something that I cannot publicly talk about. We are under a non-disclosure agreement. So what I can only mention is the information that's available publicly. But as far as the cost is concerned, instead of Chevron specifically that I may not be able to elaborate upon, I can say that the reason that we have been granted so many projects is because the cost of carbon capture that we have been able to attain. Now, definitely that's going to vary from project to project, and again, as to what you have already mentioned, percentage of CO2 in the flue gas, how you are located, the cost of utility. So there's not a single number that I can quote, but I would like to tell the audience is that the cost of carbon capture has actually come down in recent years or in recent months, I would say. Depending on who you talk to, they'll probably give you different numbers, but I think the proof of pudding is in the eating. And as companies take steps to kind of do some kind of pre-feeds, feasibility studies, we will be able to share information as far as all those numbers are concerned. And because a lot of this information is under the IP domain, and most of the companies like to protect their intellectual property. So I'm not in a position to elaborate much, but I guess in probably in months to come, when some of this information becomes public, then I guess everybody will know. But at this point, I'm limited in my comment. Ashish, anything you might want to add? Like, I don't have many.
Yeah, I mean, as Vikram said, the NDA is in place, so we cannot share a lot of information. But typically, I saw one question where was the target percent capture rate. We typically target for 90% capture rate, but if the conditions are favorable, it can go up on that. But 90% is the minimum capture rate we give on a project.
Great, guys. Thanks, Ashish.
Sure, and obviously not being able to go into project specifics, but generally speaking, you all have designed and are working this technology to be able to match with existing facilities and not anticipate huge impacts to the ability of those facilities to perform, or sort of how has that testing gone thus far in your sort of gas turbine lab models?
So there is, now I'll have to get into a slightly technicality, but there is no back pressure generated. So there is no impact on the facility in question, whether it's a natural gas turbine or any other, because that's the whole idea. It's as close to the atmospheric pressure as possible. And even the temperatures that we are talking of are fairly low. Again, I'm not going to get into specifics, but you will be surprised that, when a flue gas comes out of a natural gas fired lean burn engine, it is at 400, 450, even 5 degree Fahrenheit. But the flue gas that we treat inside our plant is substantially lower. And so there is substantial amount of heat recovery opportunity that's available, because we don't need flue gas to be at, 450 degree Fahrenheit, but substantially, hugely less temperature. And so, in terms of the amount of heat that is required for operating the plant, a lot of it can be recovered from that delta, from that gap. Yeah.
Well, great. Maybe just one more question here before we kind of transition into our break time. And again, thanks for this discussion. Earlier on, in previous speakers, there have been some questions in the chat, talking about sort of the other, pollutants or other things that can be in the flue gas stream, SOx, NOx as examples. Do you have any comment about, what maybe happens to that as a part of like the carbon capture, technology? What happens to the rest that you're not capturing, and what does that look like?
I would like Ashish to respond to that, but I'll just say that, definitely depending upon the point source, there's going to be particulates, NOx and SOx. And so the cleaner it is, the better it is for us. But, we're not living in an ideal world. And so we'll have to handle different, compositions of flue gases. Ashish, you're the expert. Take it.
Yeah, sure. The SOx and NOx, we in our system have a pretreatment system where the scrubbing of the flue gas happens with the use of appropriate chemicals, where SOx and NOx are removed before it enters the absorption tower of our unit. It is very key process for us because SOx and NOx result in solvent degradation, and further what that would do is down the line that would affect the efficiency of the carbon capture. So that's very critical. So the pre-treatment stage, we remove that part, and the flue gas which goes into the absorber, it's like very minimal SOx and NOx present on that. So this is very important for us too, because when the depleted gas flow comes out of the absorption tower, we don't want the harmful substances going into the air. So pre-treatment system is very critical for us before the whole process actually starts. So this is how we take care of the SOx and NOx present in the flue gas.
Thanks, Ashish.
Just one more point. I saw a question there about whether we can reuse CO2 in a fertilizer industry. I worked in the past in similar projects in my previous roles. Yes, it can be. And generally, it is used back into manufacturing ammonium nitrate at some of the facilities. So just I wanted to add that point to one of the questions.
That's great. Thanks so much for ensuring that we hit on all of those. Well, thank you both again for your time today. Really exciting to hear what you all are up to and the advancements of capture technology. So here to introduce our next speaker is Jessica Larson. Jessica is a volcanologist studying magma storage and movement in the crust prior to and during eruptions. She is also Associate Director of the Geophysical Institute and has the pleasure of welcoming our state geologist, Dr. David Lepane. Thank you, Jessica. Please take it away.
Thank you, Haley. Yes, thank you all for attending and asking some really great questions here. Although I am a geologist, I'm not an expert on this topic. So I'm really looking forward to our next presentation greatly. And so I'd like to introduce David Lepane. David is the Director and Alaska State Geologist for the Alaska Division of Geological and Geophysical Surveys. David has over 30 years of experience as a geologist working in Alaska, Wisconsin, and the Middle East. His focus is petroleum geology, particularly the reservoir potential of fluvial, deltaic, and deep water depositional systems. Lepane earned a PhD in geology from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. And today, David will be talking about the geology of CCS and the potential of Alaska's basins. So I'd like to now hand it over to Dave.
Well, thank you, Jessica. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining this virtual workshop, and thank you for listening to my presentation. I will give a high-level introduction to the geology of carbon capture and storage with a focus on carbon storage in the subsurface of sedimentary basins. And so I'll give the first part of the talk will be just a general overview of the geological requirements that you need to be able to store carbon in subsurface formations. And then I'll shift gears midway through the presentation and start talking about Alaska's potential to store carbon dioxide in the subsurface. So, okay, so enough talk about the introductory slide. Let's move on. This is what I want to cover. So I'll start out by just reviewing the physical and chemical characteristics of carbon dioxide. I'll then discuss briefly the requirements for geologic storage of carbon dioxide in the subsurface of a sedimentary basin. I'll talk about three important CO2 storage mechanisms in the subsurface. And then I'll talk about the different options, storing CO2 in depleted oil fields, storing CO2 in saline formations, and storing CO2 in unminable coal seams. And then I'll shift gears and I'll focus largely on Alaska's two petroleum producing basins, Cook Inlet in southern Alaska and the North Slope on the northern border of the state. And then I'll just say a word or two about Alaska's interior sedimentary basins. I will say nothing about economics. That is outside of my area of expertise, and so I won't address the economics of carbon storage. So, as most of us probably already know, at the Earth's surface, CO2 is an odorless, colorless gas. It's in the air we breathe. If you take CO2 and you increase the pressure, so you compress it, you get up to about 11 or 1200 psi, that's pounds per square inch, and it takes on properties that are midway between a gas and a liquid. So it's not quite a gas, not quite a liquid. And we refer to that as a supercritical CO2. And so that graph on the right of this slide just shows that with increasing depth in the subsurface, the pressure increases, and that's because of something we refer to as hydrostatic pressure. It's the weight of the overlying column of rock and water in the pore space. And so the hydrostatic pressure increases as you go down. And so if you take supercritical CO2 and you inject it into a subsurface formation at a depth of at least about 2,600 feet it will remain supercritical because the pressure at that depth is great enough that the CO2 will remain in that supercritical state. The reason that's important is because when you have supercritical CO2, you can store a greater amount of CO2 in the reservoir for a given unit volume of that reservoir. And so that's very important. It's also important to realize that CO2, even supercritical CO2, is buoyant. So relative to water, it wants to float. It wants to rise up through a water column. So if you inject CO2 into a subsurface formation, the pores are going to be filled with water. That CO2 is going to want to migrate through the pore network up to the crest of what we refer to as a trap. And I'll say more about that here in a minute or so. So in order for subsurface formations to be considered as targets for CO2 sequestration or storage, they have to meet certain criteria. And that's what this next slide will introduce. And so you see a cartoon diagram on the left side of the screen. That's just a simple cross section through the Kenai gas field, not too far from Soldotna, Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. And then on the right side of the slide, in the upper right, you see a photomicrograph. That's a photograph taken through a special microscope of a very thin slice of rock we call a thin section. And so you're seeing a thin section of a sandstone there. And that is from the Tyonek Formation, which is an important oil and gas producing formation in the subsurface of Cook Inlet Basin. And so you can see the sand grains there. Q stands for quartz. And all the blue in that photograph is porosity. So blue is porosity. The photo in the lower left, it looks kind of like a dark gray or black. That's a typical mudstone. It's a silty shale, actually. We refer to it generally as a mudstone from the Nanushuk Formation. It's a typical mudstone from the Nanushuk on the north slope, so northern part of the state. So that sandstone in the upper right, that is a target formation for injecting CO2 into it because those pores can be used to store CO2. And that mudstone in the lower left, that's a good example of what we would call a seal formation. So looking at the text that's in that box in the center of the slide, first requirement, you have to have a sandstone that has porosity. That's the blue space in that photo in the upper right. You have to have a sand that has permeability. So those pores have to be interconnected. That's what we mean when we say permeability. That allows a liquid, whether it's water, gas, oil, to move through the formation. It moves from pore to pore to pore. And so you have to have a porous sandstone, you have to have a permeable sandstone, and that sandstone has to be in a trapping configuration. So referring to that diagram on the left, you can see those beds, they're kind of bowed in a convex up pattern. That's a fold structure that we refer to as an anticline. That's where the beds are bowed upward like that. And so sandstones are in yellow, and the sandstones that are filled with gas, methane, are in red. And the mud rocks are shown by that pale green and flesh colored areas. And then the dark color, the black, those are coals. And so if you inject supercritical CO2 down on the limbs of that anticline into one of those sand beds, because the CO2 is buoyant, it's going to rise up through that bed. It's going to travel through the pore network because the rock is permeable, and it's going to accumulate at the crest of that fold structure. That's at the highest point of that fold structure in those sands. And it will go no farther if you have an impermeable mudstone or silty mudstone or shale formation sitting on top of that sandstone. That's what we refer to as a seal. So the fold is the trap. The mudstone overlying the sand is what we call a seal. And the porous impermeable sand is the reservoir. So you have to inject that CO2 at a depth of at least 2,600 feet. You also have to understand the geomechanics of that stratigraphy. By geomechanics, I mean you have to understand sort of the stress strain, the pressure regime at depth, because when you inject the CO2, you want to keep your injection pressures low enough so that you don't artificially fracture the rock. Industry has the technology to understand, to measure subsurface pressures. They've been doing it for many, many, many decades. And so they have the tools that are necessary to characterize the geomechanic conditions in the deep subsurface. So these are the basic requirements. Sand with porosity, sand with permeability. You have to have the sand in a trapping configuration. You have to have an impermeable seal overlying the sand, and you have to inject at a depth of at least 2,600 feet. You have to understand the geomechanics of your reservoir. So we have, we recognize 3 different storage mechanisms for CO2 in the subsurface. There's a 4th mechanism, which I kind of show grayed out. It's called mineral trapping. That is really not important for the types of sands that we have in Alaska. Mineral trapping is where you inject CO2 into a porous and permeable formation. And because of the composition of the rocks, the CO2 chemically interacts with the minerals in the rock, and you form insoluble precipitates called carbonates. You can have iron carbonates, magnesium carbonates, but the rocks that we have in the subsurface of Cook Inlet Basin, in the subsurface of the North Slope, and in the subsurface of Alaska's interior basins, they're not the right composition. So mineral trapping is really not important here. So the first mechanism is what we call buoyant trapping. And those 2 diagrams that are shown in the upper center and upper right, these are examples of how buoyant trapping would work. You inject CO2 down the limb of a train of folds. That's that CO2 injection well shown on the right side of that center diagram. Because the CO2 is buoyant, it's going to migrate up through the pore network because the rocks are permeable, and it's going to accumulate in the crest of those anticlinal structures, those upfolds. That's called buoyant trapping. Because it's buoyant relative to water, it's going to migrate up through the water column. It wants to float. The second trapping mechanism is called residual trapping, and that's just some of the CO2 as it's migrating through the pore network gets left behind. Just due to surface tension properties of the rock, it just gets stuck and it doesn't migrate farther. That's called residual trapping. And the third mechanism that is of importance here when it comes to Alaska's basins is solubility trapping. When you inject CO2 into water-filled pores, some of that CO2 is going to dissolve. And so you'll end up getting bicarbonate ion, you'll end up getting hydrogen ions floating around in the water column, And so that's what we mean when we say solubility trapping. Some of the CO2 gets dissolved in the water. So those are the 3 important trapping mechanisms that we would call upon to work in Alaska's subsurface basins. So let's move on. So you have a number of options as far as where you can store CO2 in the subsurface in a sedimentary basin. You can inject it into depleted oil fields or oil fields that are well down their decline curves. This is very attractive because in an oil field that's been producing, a lot of effort, a lot of money has been spent trying to understand the reservoir, trying to understand the trap, trying to understand and characterize the seal. So they are data rich. We really understand them very well. So they have proven reservoir, proven trap, and proven seal for hydrocarbons. So we have extensive data sets covering these features of the reservoir, trap, and seal system. We also have a lot of information on the actual three-dimensional geometry of the sand bodies. That's, liken that to a container, a shoebox with your shoes in them. You understand the geometry of that shoebox. That's the geometry of the container. In this case, we're talking about a subsurface sandstone deposit. And because we've studied these fields extensively in the past because of the economic incentive to understand them, we have a lot of information on the actual shape and geometry of those sand bodies. So they're well characterized. We also have a very good understanding of the original oil that was in place in the reservoir. That's important because it gives us a first order estimate at the potential pore volume that might be available for CO2 storage. Also, with these depleted fields, we have existing infrastructure. You might have to retrofit that infrastructure because CO2 in the presence of water develops an acid, so that would be corrosive to regular steel. So you'll probably have to modify that infrastructure so that it's resistant to the corrosive properties of CO2 and water. But also you have to spend some time trying to understand or making sure you understand the reservoir trap and seal system in the presence of CO2. We may understand that system very well in the presence of oil and gas, but CO2 is a little bit different. So you really have to do your homework and make sure you understand that system relative to CO2. You can also use CO2 to enhance oil recovery in oil fields that are well down their decline curves. That can help the economics of CO2 sequestration. So the other category of subsurface formation that could be attractive are what we refer to as saline formations. These are formations where the water that's in the pore network is not drinkable. That's because it has a lot of stuff dissolved in the water, and so you wouldn't want to drink it. And so that's what we mean when we say saline formations. They typically have total dissolved solids greater than 10,000 parts per million. That would be terrible water to drink. It'd probably make the worst cup of coffee you've ever had in your life. So it's non-potable. So these formations tend to be deeper. You would have to meet the same requirements that I outlined in the previous slide. They have to be porous, permeable, they have to be in a trapping configuration, and they have to be overlain by seals because you want to make sure that they're isolated from shallower potable water supplies. So the key take home, though, with saline formations is there hasn't been an economic incentive to study them in the past. And so they're going to be poorly constrained. They're going to be largely unknown. And so you're going to have to do a lot of upfront characterization work to understand the reservoir, the trap, and the seal characteristics before you would ever think about injecting CO2 into a saline formation. The third subsurface target for CO2 storage would be in unminable coal seams. These are seams that are too deep to be economic to mine. And so you would inject the CO2 in the seam. Most coal seams in the subsurface are naturally fractured, and those fractures would allow the CO2 to go into the seam and then have contact with a micropore network. And so you would end up being able to store CO2 in the fractures, but also in the micropores in the actual core matrix. So thing to note, most coal seams in the subsurface have methane associated with them. The methane is just the result of microbial action. There's a lot of organic material in the coal, and that organic material is food for microbes. And so they're doing their thing and they generate methane as an end result. That methane gets attached very strongly to the coal particles. It's called adsorption. Well, CO2 is more strongly attracted to coal particles than is methane. And so if you inject CO2 into a coal seam and there's methane in that coal seam, the CO2 is most likely going to displace the methane, and the methane is going to migrate out of that coal seam. So you have to have a plan to capture any displaced methane, because methane is 25 times or more potent than CO2 as a heat trapping substance in the Earth's atmosphere. So you wouldn't want to eject CO2 in the coal seam only to eject methane and have it go into the atmosphere. So you have to have a plan. You have to make sure that you understand the fate of any displaced methane. That graphic in the upper right is just a cartoon showing the fracture network in a typical coal seam. And the photo in the lower right is a prominent coal seam on the west side of Cook Inlet in the Tyonek Quad, referred to as the Capps Coal. That seam is about 50 feet thick. There are many such seams in the subsurface of Cook Inlet.
David, you're at 15 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'll try and go faster now. So this just summarizes geologic carbon storage characteristics that are required. I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So geologic carbon storage in Alaska. We have two proven hydrocarbon producing basins, Cook Inlet along the south coast and the North Slope up on the north coast. And we have a variety of interior sedimentary basins shown in that pale sort of green-yellow color between the two. So Cook Inlet is very attractive as a basin for storing CO2 because we have thousands of feet of interbedded sandstone, mudstone, and coal in that basin. All of the existing oil fields in the basin are producing from the younger stratigraphy, and that's shown in this stratigraphic column on the lower left of that slide. And the black bars just show the portion of the stratigraphy that is coal bearing. So we have 10 oil fields, 5 are relatively large. We have at least 28 gas fields. These are proven reservoirs, traps, and seals for hydrocarbons. We have 1.389 billion barrels of oil have been produced through November of 2022, and greater than 7.5 trillion cubic feet of gas has been produced. So we know that we have this pore volume that was occupied by these hydrocarbons in the past. And so this pore volume is potentially available for CO2. We also have extensive saline formations in the basin, and we have a very large volume of coal, and we have existing infrastructure. These are the reasons why Cook Inlet is attractive, but you must understand the performance of the reservoir and the presence of CO2. The other thing to note about Cook Inlet is it is a seismically active basin. All of the oil and gas fields, which are shown on this graphic in the upper right, the oil fields are shown in green, gas fields are in red. All of those fields are on large amplitude fold structures, anticlinal fold structures. Most of these folds are cored by faults. These folds owe their existence to the seismic activity in the basin. So despite the seismic activity, though, we know that hydrocarbons have been trapped in these fold structures for many millions of years. So we have no reason to believe that they wouldn't also trap CO2. So a summary of CO2 storage potential in Cook Inlet. We have depleted and declining oil and gas fields, proven porosity, proven reservoir trap and seal characteristics, existing infrastructure. We know the volume of oil that's been produced from those fields, so we would suspect or anticipate that we have that pore volume available, at least that pore volume available to store CO2. We know the basin's seismically active, but we know those reservoirs and the seals have been effective at capturing hydrocarbons for many millions of years. We would anticipate similar behavior with CO2. We have extensive capacity, potential capacity to store in saline formations, but they're uncharacterized. And we have a huge volume of coal in the subsurface. And so there's a lot of potential to store it in coal, roughly 43 billion tons estimated by Schellenbaum and Clough. But you have to understand the fate of the displaced methane. Moving to the North Slope, similar argument. Thousands of feet of interbedded sandstone and mudstone, abundant coal west of Umiat, more than 70 oil accumulations. Many of those oil accumulations have original oil in place, much greater than 1 billion barrels. We have 17.88 billion barrels of oil produced as of the end of November 2022. So we have at least that pore volume to potentially store CO2. Saline formations are extensive. And so we know we have a large volume of pore space potentially available for CO2 storage. This is the generalized stratigraphic column of the North Slope. Black bars also show coal. All of these formations have the potential to sequester CO2. You also have infrastructure in the core field areas, and so that's a money savings. But you must evaluate the reservoir potential, the trap behavior in the presence of CO2, same as with Cook Inlet. So this is a summary of the North Slope. In the interest of time, I'll just move beyond this. I've already stated most of this in my previous slide. And my last slide, interior basins. So we have the North Slope. Obviously, up in the northern part of the state, we have Cook Inlet along the south coast, and you see all of these olive green sedimentary basins in between. Yukon Flats Basin is labeled, Nenana Basin. Susitna Basin is not labeled. It's just north of Cook Inlet. And then you've got the Copper River Basin. All of these basins are data poor. The best known are the Susitna, Nenana, and Yukon Flats basins. We have seismic in all three of those basins. We have several wells from the Nenana Basin. We have some wells, exploration wells in the Susitna Basin, but still they're all relatively data poor. We know that they're non-marine, so the stratigraphy is non-marine. We know that the reservoirs are likely to be laterally discontinuous, and the seals will likely be laterally discontinuous. So we have the same situation in Cook Inlet, but in Cook Inlet, we know that we have a number of oil and gas fields where the reservoir trap and seal works. We don't have that in these interior basins. So a lot of upfront work would have to be done to characterize their potential. And, oh, by the way, there's no infrastructure. So that would really seriously impact the economics because you have to build all of the infrastructure. That's all I have. It took me a little bit longer. Sorry about that. Thanks for your patience, and thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Dave. Okay, we have a few good questions coming in. One question is, what about CO2 sequestration in hydrates at Prudhoe Bay with associated methane production?
That is definitely a possibility. There are extensive methane hydrates accumulations on the North Slope associated with permafrost and near the base of the permafrost column. We're still trying to understand how to produce those methane hydrates. There's an enormous resource there in terms of methane, but it's a true statement that we're still trying to understand how to produce that resource. And so I'm not sure exactly how CO2 would interact with methane hydrates. I don't know if it would assist production, if it would hinder production. I just really can't comment on that because it's outside of my area of expertise. But I will just say that there's, as you pointed out, it's an enormous resource up there. And as the climate warms and permafrost thaws, that methane, a significant amount of that methane is potentially going to be released to the atmosphere. And it would be really nice to be able to capture that and utilize it. So.
Great. Thank you. Okay, another question. You described the geology of how CO2 trapping could work in these anticlinal structures in terms of the porosity, but then also the strata or the rock layers that might form an impermeable cap. And I'm just wondering, what is the sealing capacity of those sealing rocks in these different basins in Alaska where sequestration might be taking place?
That's a good question. In the oil and gas industry, geologists and petrophysicists and geoscience professionals understand the seal capacity of mud rocks by collecting samples, and they send them out to a laboratory for analysis. And the test that they do is called mercury injection capillary pressure analysis, MICP for short. And we have lots and lots of data. Industry does. DGGS has a lot of data, MICP data for Cook Inlet. We also have some data for the North Slope and some of the interior sedimentary basins. Industry has a lot of this data because this is one of the ways they understand how a seal will behave. And they understand seal capacity in terms of the hydrocarbon column height that a seal can hold back. Remember, hydrocarbons are buoyant also. Oil wants to float on water, so it's going to move up to the crest of a trap, and it's going to exert pressure, upward pressure on the overlying seal. So MICP data tells you the height, the column height of oil or gas that a particular seal can hold back. You can do the same analysis for CO2. You can submit a sample of a mud rock to a laboratory, and they will do the MICP test relative to a column height of CO2. And so that's really important information to get. In Cook Inlet, most of the mud rocks in the younger stratigraphy, there really aren't much in the way of clay shales in Cook Inlet. A good clay shale at depth is pretty much impermeable. It's impermeable for a long time. Most of the seals in Cook Inlet are silty clay stones, clayey silt stones. And so in a strict sense, over long periods of time, they may not be perfectly impermeable. So what you want to do is you want to collect samples of those seals. You want to submit them for laboratory analysis, MICP analysis, so that you understand what kind of column height of CO2 those seals can hold back. And then you make sure, once you have that data, then you make sure you don't exceed those column heights. And if you're not exceeding those column heights, then you can be reasonably confident that your seal is going to be effective.
Right.
I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that was great. Okay, a couple of questions that are kind of related to each other. One is there anywhere in Alaska where you think mineral trapping by CO2 reactions with, say, basaltic rocks, anywhere that might work? And then follow-on question, I'll just add this in there real quick. In that case, how would you handle injection wells and injectivity, like in Iceland?
That's a really good question. There's last I heard, there's a pilot project underway in Iceland right now. In Iceland, sits atop the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. It's a rift setting, and there are porous and permeable, very young basalts. The island is made of these, and they're throughout the island. And so they also have extensive geothermal power generated on Iceland. And so they are powering, essentially the geothermal plants are providing the power to inject CO2 into these shallow, porous, and permeable basaltic formations. And you're actually getting the CO2 to react with the basalt, the iron and magnesium in those basaltic rocks. And they're precipitating out various types of iron and magnesium carbonates. So that's mineral trapping. Great example. In Alaska, we don't have a large volume of porous and permeable basaltic rocks like they have in Iceland. We have a lot of what we refer to as mafic, M-A-F-I-C, mafic rocks scattered in various places around the state. Mafic just stands for magnesium and iron silicates, essentially. So you've got the magnesium and you've got the iron, and those minerals are very reactive, but most of those formations they're fairly old and they don't have a lot of permeability or porosity. And so you wouldn't really have a great ability to inject CO2 into those formations without stimulating them. You'd have to artificially create the permeability so that you could inject CO2 into those rocks. I think the composition is right, though, for many of these formations. So you would get these reactions moving forward, but it probably boiled down to economics. You'd have to get the CO2 to where those formations are. Then you'd have to artificially fracture them. And so there'd be a lot of money up front spent on characterizing the potential and then building out the infrastructure to actually do it. Another way to do it, though, this would also be probably capital intensive and pretty expensive, would be to actually mine those rocks where they're at the surface. If you've got these iron and magnesium rich rocks at the surface, mine them, and then you move them to a processing facility and you combine them with CO2 in, say, a large scale reaction vessel. And then you could get the CO2 to precipitate out as these various types of carbonates. Whether or not that would work at scale, I don't know, but it's theoretically possible.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was a very informative answer. Great. Thank you so much for your presentation, Dave.
Thank you.
Really fascinating. And with that, I think it's time to turn it back to you, Haley.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica and David. Really appreciate all the questions that are coming up in the chat. I know sometimes we can't get to all of them in a particular discussion, but just a note for the audience that we can always send direct messages after the presentation to the speaker if there's something that you didn't hear get brought up and you'd like them to dive into that. So even if it doesn't come up in this section, there's still an opportunity to talk directly to that speaker. Or we do have a lineup set up for tomorrow that may have a speaker that may be better positioned to answer some of those questions. I think I saw something earlier related to transportation. And we do have a speaker tomorrow that will be talking to us a little bit about gas storage and transportation here in Alaska. So stay tuned. All these questions are really valuable and we do appreciate it. So now we'll go ahead and transition into our next panelist. So we've talked a bit about the geology, and now we're really going to get into the business and economic casewood. So I'd like to introduce Rochelle Johnson. She'll be our moderator for the next presentation. Rochelle is born and raised in Alaska and a graduate of UAA. She now lives and works in Anchorage, where she is an economic developer at the University of Alaska Center for Economic Development. In addition to working on the center's applied research and strategic planning projects, she co-facilitates the Alaska Nuclear Working Group and coordinates ongoing work on the Alaska Advanced Nuclear Roadmap. Rochelle is passionate about energy as an economic development enabler, both as a tool for community and economic development and a growing innovative industry. So thank you so much, Rochelle, for moderating this next panelist.
Thank you, Haley. I am personally looking forward to our next presentation. As we've been hearing, the CCUS market is rapidly changing and the need for CCUS projects is growing. There are a lot of shifting variables in that market, which all have the potential to really impact the business model and economics of future projects. Our next presenter approaches that topic of the business case and economics of CCUS with that in mind. I would like to welcome Nicholas Fullard to the stage. Nick has over 4 decades of experience in the energy industry. He started his career with British Gas in the UK before establishing a US subsidiary in 2000 and moving to North America. He has since moved over to Gaffney Klein in 2014, and for the last 3 to 4 years has increasingly focused on the energy transition, especially CCUS. Nick has supported a range of international clients and worked extensively in the US Gulf Coast. Nick recently moved to Alaska, so he gets to shovel snow in April with the rest of us in Anchorage, where he's assisting with aspects of the CCUS opportunity as well as other energy transition innovations. Just a note, following Nick's presentation, we will be doing a moderated Q&A as time allows. If you have questions, please put them in the chat. I will monitor it and we will address questions as time allows. Nick, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. This is very much one of my favorite topics. And just to lead into the topic, I mean, Gaffney Klein might be well known to some of you as from its expertise in geoscience and so forth. And obviously we do a lot of that, and very interesting presentations that we've had this morning on many of those topics. But as we approach the sort of major deployment of capital in what promises to be, I think, a huge new industry, the question that we're asked more and more by pension funds, by infrastructure funds, and the sorts of entities that will finance this type of work is, well, okay, we understand the science, we understand the technology, but how on earth do you get this stuff to make your money? And so within the sort of Gaffney Klein envelope, that's kind of what I've spent a lot of time on over the last 2-3 years. And Rochelle mentioned that I've been working a lot with clients in the Gulf Coast area, which probably is right at the sort of cutting edge of this stuff. So what I wanted to do today was perhaps relate some of this to where things are here in Alaska and sort of paint a picture of the sort of economic and commercial opportunity that exists. So let's start with some numbers. So let's start looking at carbon sequestration, and actually to qualify this a little, I should say that what I'm talking about here is geological sequestration. By and large, some of the more advanced projects that are really at the point of signing contracts with emitters depending on how much compression and pipeline and injection wells and so forth you have to include, the market is kind of stabilizing at about a sort of $20 per ton tariff for sequestering carbon in a geological formation. So let's circle back to Dave's presentation that we just heard, and we've got these numbers for Alaska. Maybe 50 gigatons of storage potential, maybe even more. So 50 gigatons at $20 a ton, that's $1 trillion right there. Now, in reality, of course, the ability to kind of capture and sequester carbon will take place over many, many years. But even if we looked at a fairly modest 25 million ton per annum scheme for sequestering carbon, at $20 a ton, that's $500 million per annum. So, really quite significant numbers right there. So let's look at blue hydrogen and blue ammonia in particular. Just to be clear what I'm talking about here, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, they're made from natural gas, but in combination with carbon sequestration, a good portion of the CO2 involved in the value chain is removed, maybe up to about 90%. And so what we produce is what's called a low carbon fuel. It's not net zero, it's not zero carbon, but it goes a long way towards the sort of green equivalents of green hydrogen and green ammonia. Now, everyone in Alaska must know all about the gas line project, the LNG project, call it what you will. So all that North Slope gas, it has the potential to generate maybe 15, 20 million tons per annum of blue ammonia. Right now, if you sell a low carbon product like that to Europe or to Asia, you generate a premium over the standard high carbon version. It's about $50 a ton at the moment. So right there, 20 million tons per annum, $50 per ton premium. That's $1 billion. So let's move on to the nature-based offsets. And here we're kind of venturing into kind of really undefined territory. The market, the voluntary market, as it's called for nature-based offsets, is just emerging. The rules and regulations and economics are beginning to sort of come together. But by and large, an acre of forest traps about 70 tons of carbon. And if you manage forestry properly, on a kind of sustainable basis, and if you put the effort around carbon management in addition to forest management, let's say you can sequester about 10 tons per annum on a sustainable basis. It depends very much on the terrain and so forth, but it's a good enough guess for now. So the state has around 40 million acres of forestry under management. So at around even a a 5 ton per acre sequestration level, $20 a ton maybe for a nature-based offset. But there again, it comes to the billions. It's about $2 billion. So we're talking, way into the future here. But I wanted to kind of paint that picture. Because in the context of Alaska's economy, its oil and gas production, its minerals production, this new chapter in carbon is as big, if not bigger, depending on how the markets develop. So hopefully I've kind of whetted your appetite, and now I'll sort of talk about the kind of nitty-gritty a little bit more. So again, let's just take a step back and think, well, what is it we're talking about in Alaska? Well, on the sort of front edge of this technology is geological sequestration, which we've heard a lot about today and we'll hear more about tomorrow. It's a very measurable technology. You can capture the CO2 from power generation or from petrochemicals or from ammonia. You can compress it and you can very securely inject it into the ground in a way which will keep it safe for millennia. So that's probably going to be the near-term focus for Alaska for the next little while. But if we look at the wider picture and these nature-based offsets, that's a different type of approach. It's saying, well, if we can, using predominantly nature-based techniques, we can sequester CO2 from the atmosphere, we can keep it safe. And on the basis of doing that, somebody else somewhere in a completely different country potentially can essentially balance their CO2 emissions in a way which leaves us a kind of a net zero outcome. So these two families, these two ways to manage carbon, are both very much in the sights at the moment in Alaska. But I think the nature-based offsets has a kind of a slower fuse associated with it. So how do the two relate? Well, they do relate. And one example of a promising technology where they relate is if you can use biomass, wood pellets and so forth as a means to generate electricity in a thermal power station, you can then couple that with the geological sequestration, and you can recapture that CO2, you can store it in the ground, and in effect, you have a kind of a carbon removal technology, which not only eliminates carbon on a net zero basis, but it creates this kind of net negative equation, which will enable us to reduce the CO2 in the atmosphere as opposed to building it. So at the moment, that's the kind of holy grail of carbon sequestration, is to create that kind of net negative equation, which a combination of these technologies is able to do. So what are the sort of driving factors behind this? So ultimately, we have demand drivers, and these are things which create an environment where an emitter or power generator or petrochemical plant has the means to pay for their emissions to be captured. And one of the big features behind this is consumer trends. And for those of you particularly who spend time in Europe or Asia, you'll probably be aware that the sort of general profile and awareness of CO2 and sustainability in society generally is growing quite rapidly, as it is here in the US. So these consumer trends with a kind of willingness to pay extra for a product. For example, in Europe, you can, when you fill up your car for certain petrol gas providers, you can choose a pump that will deliver you net zero petrol. And it's gasoline, that's had the CO2 accounted for, probably through a nature-based mechanism or similar. But, you have to pay extra for it. But these sorts of things are increasing. Obviously, government policy, ESG factors, many companies now are really focusing on how they operate themselves, and they want to do so in a much more sustainable manner. And then, of course, you've got tax and credits, like 45Q, which I'll come on to talk about. Then you've got the supply drivers, which will lower the cost of dealing with emissions. A lot of these are technology related. Some of them are economies of scale, and certainly if you look at the Gulf Coast experiences, these hubs are very much the way people are going. Green financing is becoming more important, where the cost of debt is significantly lower for a project that has significant carbon management features associated with it. And then, of course, you've got subsidies of different sorts. So what does that mean in terms of Alaska? What's the profit pool that Alaska can participate in order to create a sustainable economic framework around carbon sequestration? So you've got, if you like, the carrot approach. And one of probably the biggest carrot at the moment, if you have a project in the US, are the federal tax incentives. 45Q is the biggest and most important for carbon sequestration, but there are other tax incentives which go with low carbon fuels and so forth. Under the infrastructure bill, under the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a whole host of economic stimuli which relate to low carbon technologies. And one of the key features of all the successful carbon management projects is this ability to kind of stack all these different things together. As I think of the carbon projects that have reached FID, most of them involve some kind of stacking of different benefits from different sources. And one of the key sources of that are the cap and trade revenues available from Europe, the low carbon fuel standard available in California. So if you can combine that with 45Q, then you start to generate quite a compelling financial picture. So these are all kind of external stimuli which will be used inevitably to support the development of Alaska's geological resources. And as you look at them, the carrots that I've talked about are predominantly generated by US federal policy, and the sticks are predominantly from international policy, and I'll come and talk about that a little bit more. So why is it that governments are putting all this money into CCS? Well, for countries that rely significantly on oil and gas production, and of course Alaska, not quite a country, but it could almost be. For Alaska, the oil and gas economy continues to be very important, and being able to transform that economy in a way which is consistent with the global demand for lower carbon fuels, obviously hugely important for the state. And it also enables Alaska's products to capture a premium, whether it's in the US or indeed internationally. It also extends the kind of oil and gas production era. And, we're venturing into slightly controversial territory here. But ultimately, what we're all worried about is the emissions, the CO2. It doesn't really matter what the original source of the fuel is, provided you can address the CO2. But, this is still something that I think global economies are coming to terms with. I mentioned finance. Turning the equation around, if you're an economy that relies on manufacturing, being able to manufacture low carbon products improves global competitiveness, creates jobs, and is generally a good thing. One of the areas that's growing is cross-border CO2 transactions. You've got countries like Japan, Singapore, perhaps, that have a significant manufacturing economy, but no viable sequestration routes. So for them, exporting CO2 to a region that can store it becomes quite a significant feature. And of course, in that context, Alaska is an ideal partner, given its huge storage potential and its relatively small emissions. So I mentioned that there are two carbon markets. One is to do with compliance, which is carbon tax, it's emissions trading, and the other is voluntary, where people are sort of, basically wanting to address carbon and are willing to pay for it. So let's focus on the compliance market for a moment. 17 countries have a combination of carbon tax and emissions trading. 19 more have a more market-based emissions trading system, and more still have a carbon tax but no emissions trading. So as we look at this, most of the large economies of the world have some kind of carbon mechanism to do with them, and that's growing all the time. And if you layer on the voluntary market, obviously it gets much bigger, but nevertheless, it's already sizable. So then from an economics question, the issue is, well, if you look at the ETS price, if you look at the carbon tax, is it actually enough money to support CCUS in terms of the full value chain? And the answer is not really. So around 4% of the emissions trading systems and carbon tax mechanisms are broadly sufficient to support scalable carbon capture. So we're kind of getting there, we're moving in the right direction, but there's still a way to go. And as you look at the carbon sequestration projects around the world, almost all of them involve some kind of plugging the gap, if you like, making the economic equation work between the sort of carbon incentives that exist from these markets and the cost of doing it. And that's exactly what 45Q does. It's a way of enabling projects which otherwise aren't economic to become economic. And that's why schemes such as that are very important at the moment. So let's look at the sort of cost revenue equation for a moment. At the bottom of this graph, you have this kind of, sort of equation in terms of the projects that are easy to capture, like a gas processing plant on the one hand, and those which are very difficult and very expensive, like direct air capture on the right-hand side. So you have this kind of cost curve which affects it. And if you look at where 45Q used to be, it's kind of flat rate, used to be $50 a ton. And so you can see that really a lot of those easy projects on the left-hand side fall under that. You can make money doing that. But for most of the projects which are on the right-hand side, it's still not enough. So look at where 45Q has moved to. You've got up to $85 a ton now, additional sum for direct air capture. So you can see the beginnings of kind of matching the revenue graph with the cost graph. So then if you take the current cost base for CCS and you think, well, if the industry follows the same path that unconventional gas and some of these other sort of similar technologies have followed, we're going to get rid of that cost curve, we're going to move it down, and we're going to create a lower cost curve, and we're going to capture more and more projects under this kind of revenue positive regime, and maybe even some of those which are currently out of reach, like direct air capture. So this is the trend, and this is how more and more projects will become economic. So just a brief word about oil and gas, certainly for Alaska, as I say, particularly important. And as I mentioned, using CCS technology, about, give or take, about 90% of the carbon footprint associated with gas production can be addressed. And as a result, you're creating a more competitive fuel. And potentially, instead of looking at a kind of a declining growth rate, there are definitely opportunities for further investment. And interestingly, they're happening just at the time when Alaska might be looking at this next phase, this next chapter in gas production. Just a few headlines here. LNG, obviously very important for the state. LNG has probably been one of the first industry segments to really embrace carbon management. And a lot of it is simply because of what you read here. It's that the countries that consume LNG are increasingly concerned about the type of fuel they're using and its carbon content. And as a result, being able to produce a low carbon LNG is increasingly important. And that's something certainly which CCS in combination with Alaska's gas potential has the opportunity to do. So a quick run around some of the projects, and I won't hesitate on this because you're hearing a lot about some of these examples over the next couple of days. Suffice to say that this is a kind of a burgeoning industry. Every week, more and more projects are being announced. And, the way in which those projects are coming about is sort of facilitating a kind of a new business model for CCS. You've got the capture, which continues to be quite complex and almost tailor-made for the plant that it's built for. So that tends to be being dealt with by the emitter. But then you've got the aggregation and transmission segments, which are very similar to the gas midstream. It's compression, it's pipelines, it's ships. And then you've got the sequestration, which, you've heard about from Dave and others, where it's a complex area. There's data still to be gathered. But nevertheless, people are becoming more comfortable with that. So just to finish off in terms of prepared comments, let's looking back at the carbon industry globally. There is significant technical risk. The way in which carbon is sequestered, whether it be in gas reservoirs, whether it be in saline aquifers, they're becoming better defined. The financial incentives are sufficient now that it's driving a lot of technology companies, driving a lot of startups. It's creating that kind of financial incentive, which is promoting investment and time and research. And, the cost base is improving. I think the Gulf Coast model is showing that, where, very rapidly, and it's particularly the sort of transference of oil and gas technology, and gas in particular, into this kind of new carbon environment is producing some good synergies and good understanding. And, one of the things which has been talked about a lot in Alaska, obviously, is the kind of regulatory and legislative framework which goes with it. Luckily, Alaska has a few models to learn from, and we'll be hearing more about those. But, the insurance market, the bond market is starting to participate. The Class 6 permits, which you'll be hearing about next, I think, still represent a little bit of a constraint. But slowly but surely, the regulatory authorities are beginning to come to grips with that. And, the significant, there continue to be, risks around funding and how that happens. But with that, I'll finish off and maybe got time for one or two questions.
Thank you, Nick. So to start off the questions, I was wondering if you could dive a little bit deeper into some of the changes that the Inflation Reduction Act means for the CCUS market. The IRA included a number of provisions and incentives for CCUS, and you briefly mentioned the 45Q tax credits. How do you see it evolving?
Yeah, that's a great one to start with. Real quick top line response. At $50 a ton, which is what the incentive used to be, something like an LNG pretreatment plant, an ethanol plant, something which produces kind of high pressure, high purity CO2, you'd be rushing to collect your 45Q because that would more than cover your costs. Things like hydrogen, ammonia, depending on the scale and the economics, you are sort of teetering on the brink, but at $50, you're not quite there. And certainly any kind of power generation application that you can't do at $50. So at 85, the great thing is that it's spurred now a lot of investment in ammonia. So we're looking at a lot of startup ammonia plants in the Gulf Coast region, mainly focused on exports to other countries. Some power generation is starting to become potentially feasible at that level. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. The one feature of 45Q which continues to cause some concern is that it's of a limited duration. And when you're looking at the scale of pre-productive capital required to invest in one of these plants to get it going, you need these kind of long-term revenues to secure that, and they're not quite there yet. But all in all, big improvement, and it does seem to be having an effect because ever since the IRA, we've seen a huge uptick in interest.
I would agree, which is why we're having this conversation. So briefly at the end, you mentioned sort of a large amount of uncertainty or risk associated with CCUS. And often when there is that risk, markets find ways to compensate for that risk in dollars and cents. How do you see that playing out in the CCUS industry?
Yeah. Well, one of the bullet points I put on my last slide there is the fact that the bond market and the insurance market are starting to get their heads around all this. And a little bit like abandonment, for offshore, we're talking about huge liabilities that kind of sit there. And if you like, people didn't used to think about them. But then ultimately, with CO2, we're talking about needing to know that you're able to store it securely for, indefinitely. And corporations typically don't get on well with that kind of, unending liability. But I think a lot of the more sophisticated insurance companies and financial institutions, they're looking at carbon sequestration, and they're sort of looking at it and thinking, well, it's not so different to the oil and gas industry that we've been participating in for a long time. So why shouldn't we offer products to take that risk away from investors? And so I see that as a very promising feature, which I think will help, along with the rapidly increasing understanding of the sort of geoscience, which Dave and others have talked about.
Very true. Very true. So I guess pivoting to more of an Alaska focus, you mentioned a couple of times that there is a lot of opportunity for Alaska in this space, and that the part of the benefit of the IRA and of federal incentive programs is trying to spur this evolving economy. Yeah. Especially for hydrocarbon markets. What do you see as the first steps that Alaska could take to sort of pivot towards this or prepare themselves for growing opportunity? And I think of this in jobs terms, but that doesn't have to mean jobs.
Yeah. So in terms of geological sequestration, Unlike Texas or Louisiana, you don't drive from here to Fairbanks and drive through an endless corridor of petrochemical plants like you do in Texas. So the good thing is that Alaska has very low emissions. And if you like, then the focus on the storage resource is more an external one. And, we know from comments that we've heard from senior politicians and so forth that, for example, Japan is very interested in Alaska as a potential sequestration destination for CO2, which might also be allied to energy exports from the state. So, in that sense, international engagement, I think promoting the import potential of Alaska in a CCUS context is key. And if you like, the other sort of economically powerful leg of that, it would be to link it with energy exports, but with a very low carbon footprint. And, Alaska has this long history of kind of commodity-based industries, and therefore, systems and record keeping and data, which supports it, which is hugely powerful at the moment. Because if you look at some of the other potential destinations for CO2, particularly the kind of nature-based mechanisms, they're not well defined, they're not well regulated, and the confidence that various countries would place in that would be quite low. So in that sense, Alaska has this kind of unique attribute.
Well, thank you very, very much, Nick, for joining us today and providing insights into this aspect of CCUS. With that, I will hand the reins back over to Haley.
Thanks so much, Rochelle, and thank you, Nick, for sharing today. Really appreciate understanding more about the economics and business case here. I think you guys, maybe intentionally or not, did a really lovely transition into our next speaker. So what we're going to be moving into is really looking at what does it take for the regulatory environment for one of these projects. And fortunately for us, we have Richard Suggs joining us. He is the Geologic Manager and UIC Class 6 Program Manager for the Oil and Gas Division of the North Dakota Department of Mineral Resources. Richard has a BS and MS in geology and has worked for the past 15 years in the regulation and oversight of oil and gas industry in North Dakota. His work now includes geologic investigations, wellbore construction, evaluation, reservoir modeling, and review of carbon capture and storage projects. North Dakota has really been taking the lead in the lower 48 on these projects and has been a wonderful example for us to sort of learn from in terms of that regulatory environment. And so as the first state to permit Class 6 wells and to permit these projects that are actively injecting, thought it'd be really helpful to learn what actually goes into this regulatory environment and what are the regulators ensuring the safety of and protections for when moving forward with CCS. So thank you, Richard, for the conversation today, and I'll turn the reins over to you.
All right. So hello, everybody. As Haley noted, my name is Richard Suggs. I work for the North Dakota Industrial Commission, Department of Mineral Resources, Oil and Gas Division. We are the agency that is the primary Class 6 program. We manage the Class 6 program here in North Dakota, geologic storage of carbon dioxide. As one of the only only a couple states that has received primacy over its Class 6 program, and I believe still the only state with an active Class 6 well. I was asked to present here today specifically on how the state of North Dakota reviews a Class 6 facility application. I intend to try to distill the what, why, and how of a storage facility review, a process that takes weeks to months, into a few slides here with some key points, so please wish me luck. Before I dig in, though, I want to make it clear how Class 6 or carbon sequestration is done in North Dakota. Federally, everything with the UIC Class 6 program is done in North Dakota. We have the concept of a storage facility permit. All of the modeling that's done is done at the facility level. The area of review is defined at the facility level. Storage facilities can have multiple injection wells. But the authorization of a storage facility does not inherently grant authorization to inject. We still issue the classic Class 6 permits, and authorization to inject is only granted after review of the constructed wells, cement isolation, and mechanical integrity testing is done. This slide is basically a very high level overview of the entire process of bringing a CO2 storage facility from concept through permitting, operations, and to the abandonment and closure of the facility. Note there are two tracks here, one being an operator tract and one being a regulatory tract. The operator tract really begins with project planning and continues through storage operation and eventually closure. The regulatory track comes into play when we first receive some initial communications about a possible facility and continues all the way through to abandonment of the facility. My talk today will essentially focus on permitting the facility, one small portion of this whole process. But before I go into the specifics of reviewing the storage application, I'll briefly discuss the process of getting a complete application together and in front of us in the first place. And then I'll go through that, reviewing the permit facility. And if I have time at the end, I'll touch base on a little bit of the facility operations and the regulatory process and long-term stewardship as it's defined in North Dakota. So this whole process begins with project planning. It's a years-long process. They begin in an initial screening phase where they identify, using legacy data, they identify the basic project area, some volumes they intend to inject, and the potential reservoirs. They move on to feasibility studies where they'll drill some test wells, acquire a new core, run some new logs, and they'll potentially acquire 2D or 3D seismic over the area. they assimilate all that information, integrate it into a model, a 3D model of the reservoir, the upper and lower confining zones, and they'll begin numerical simulations. Basically, they want to simulate what CO2 injection into the reservoir will look like, and how the reservoir will behave as CO2 is injected. Once they have all that together, they can actually begin developing their storage facility application. And during this time frame, they'll also they'll begin acquiring stuff like pore space agreements. They might begin some baseline monitoring, and they may begin some public outreach. At this point in time in the project, public outreach is purely determined at the operator's discretion, but the common types of outreach would be town hall style meetings or individual meetings between landowners and land negotiators. Once the operator or applicant has prepared a draft storage facility, they will typically submit that to us for preliminary review. We'll look it over for completeness and provide feedback on any issues we feel need to be addressed or clarified before submitting the formal application. That's typically maybe a 1 to 2 months review of the initial draft application. Upon receipt of the formal facility application, we finally find ourselves in that orange box that I referenced earlier, and specifically on this one line in that larger diagram of the oil and gas division review. This is approximately a 2-month review on its own. Once we've gone through the review, which I'll get into the pieces of that momentarily, we will send the application on to our Department of Environmental Quality here in North Dakota, which also has a hand in regulating carbon sequestration. They will typically take a 1-month review period of that. And once we receive their comments back, we can docket the hearing or docket the issue for hearing, in which case we docket a public hearing and initiate a 30-day public comment period. The operator, prior to the hearing, is also required to provide a 45-day notice of the hearing to all of the participating owners or lessees in the area of the facility. Finally, after the hearing is held, we can begin writing orders and issuing the permit for the facility and amalgamating lands and assuring financial assurance has been met for the facility. Now, to jump into the actual review and the process of the CO2 storage facility, this slide includes all of the typical sections that would be included in a CO2 storage application. These applications take months to put together. The first applications we received were on the excess of 1,000 pages between narrative exhibits and appendices. Recent applications have been streamlined significantly down to the 300 to 500 pound range, the 300 to 500 page range. Still plenty heavy. All of the sections listed above are important and do get a fair amount of review, but most of our time and our effort is invested in reviewing the geologic exhibits, the geologic model, and the numerical simulation. I like to think that the geologic exhibits lay the foundation for a storage facility. The geologic model builds a house. Where's that CO2 going to be stored? And the numerical simulation is how's that going to be filled out? How is that house furnished or decorated? It can be done in a million different ways. The goal is to do it safely and effectively. Note, all of my following slides will essentially touch in order on these different sections of this application. Fair warning, when I get to these plan slides, they turn into wall of text style slides. My apologies for that, but it's very similar to how the information is presented in the application. It's a lot of what would be considered dry and technical reading. I'll touch on them. I'll highlight a few key points and move on. Don't feel the need to read the slides, but hopefully you get something out of them. So to start, the pore space section in an application in North Dakota, we require that this section document a recognition that the surface owner is the owner of the pore space in North Dakota. Our statutes or laws in North Dakota require that the operator make a good faith effort to obtain consent of all parties in the facility area, and that all non-consenting owners are still compensated fairly. Also requires proper notice of all hearings be provided to those entities. What you see on the right here is an example of a pore ownership map. which includes a list of all the owners. It displays the list of all the owners in the facility area. It's typically accompanied by a tabular reference, which would list the owners, the number of acres they own, calculate their participation within the facility, and whether or not that owner had signed consent or a lease of their acreage. The geologic exhibits, as I indicated before, kind of lay the foundation for everything here. The storage lay the foundation of the storage facility. They collect and present all the basic geologic data that's available out there, as well as what the operator has collected in its site-specific evaluations. This section includes information on the injection reservoir, the upper and lower confining zones. It usually includes information about depth, the areal extent, thickness, mineralogy, porosity, permeability, etc. It also includes geomechanical information on these zones, including if there are any fractures, what the stress might be, the ductility or rock strength, and any in situ fluid pressures. As part of this section, the operator provides any information on regional or tectonic activity and what the seismic history looks like in the area. Luckily in North Dakota, that's minimal, but it's important that the operator be able to make a determination that any seismicity, if it were to occur, would not interfere with confinement. We also have requirements that the confining zone must be free of transmissive faults or fractures. So up here on the diagram here, I've highlighted a couple of potential injection reservoirs, the confining zones, and what has been identified as the deepest underground source of drinking water in the state of North Dakota, the Fox Hills Formation. Along with this section, they are also expected to identify any overlying strata that may act as preventing fluid migration or act as a pressure dissipation zone or additional opportunities for monitoring and mitigation or remediation. And so in North Dakota, that happens to include this large section of rock, several thousand feet of rock that includes the Pierre Formation, the Colorado Group, and the Dakota being a thief zone or a place where any pressure that was leaking could dissipate to. One other thing that's required in this section is that they identify any potential mineral resources, both above or below the facility. Typically, it'd be coal resources identified above the facilities and or oil and gas resources identified below. So this slide is a bunch of examples of the types of geologic information that would be provided. Note here, this blue box is the whole geologic model, which is the subject of the next couple slides. The purple box is the area where the numerical simulation was done, which is several slides after that. The gray dots happen to be individual wells where they collected and extracted log information, which includes gamma ray, porosity, and resistivity information. They take that information, come up with the properties that the storage reservoir or the confining zones would have. They map those formations from one well to the next, making cross sections, making structure maps or a map to the depth at the top of the formation, making isopac maps, the thickness of the formation. They'll also present 2D or 3D seismic information, critical for identifying whether the confining zones are free of transmissive faults or fractures and supporting the tectonic history of the area. All of that basic geologic information goes into building the house or the geologic model. The intent here is that they take all that complex geologic information and the variability that is inherent in these logs, and they simplify it down to a few lithology types. In this example, it's been simplified to sandstones and dolomites with a few anhydrites. They then take and build a three-dimensional representation of the area where they plan to inject the CO2. And they fill the area between wells, control points being wells where they have actual information. They fill all the space between that by statistically evaluating what the expectation for that reservoir might look like. And they populate reasonable and representative information into the model. One note here is we don't actually review the model itself. We don't have the same software that the models are developed in. However, that model information is imported into numerical simulation software, and we can review the model properties in that numerical simulation software package. And that this geologic model is imported into that software package. So this is an example of a geologic model once it's been imported into the numerical software package that we do have access to and we will run. Here you can see an example of the porosity as it's been distributed through the model area. This is the reservoir, injection reservoir itself, being the Broom Creek Formation. Above it in the green and below it in the blue are the upper and lower confining zones. And what's neat about the numerical simulation is we can take and do 2D cross sections or 3D representations of any of the parameters that have been imported into the model, whether it's porosity, permeability, water saturations, gas storage saturations once injection has been simulated, etc. The numerical simulation, to continue the analogy of running the numerical simulation, is like filling up that house. It can be done in many different ways. But the numerical simulation allows for us to simulate what CO2 injection into that geologic model will look like. It allows us to apply different parameters as limiting factors. It allows us to test how sensitive the simulation is to changes in various parameters, and helps us to evaluate the reason that the parameters being used in the model are reasonable and conservative values, and modeling assumptions being made. The ultimate goal here with numerical simulation is to work out what is expected to be the most realistic plume under the expected operating conditions, both during and after injection activity. Note, when reviewing this numerical simulation, the state will verify that reasonable properties have been used in the model. We'll cross-reference those models, those properties in the model, along with the properties that were presented in those geologic exhibits and submitted to us as raw data in the form of logs and core information. So an example of what numerical simulation outputs. This example is after the period of 20 years of CO2 injection and a stabilized plume extents. So this middle plot here in the middle, it has the CO2 plume in red, the post CO2 migration plume in orange around it. And then on the left and right, you see north-south and east-west cross sections through that same plume done at the end of injection and after plume has stabilized. And so this is the type of example and the outputs from that numerical simulation given typical operating parameters. Injection of CO2 in the reservoir can also cause changes in the reservoir. Some of the injected CO2 will dissolve in the native brines or the water that's already in the rock. This decreases the pH and the brine becomes more acidic. Some of the minerals dissolve under these conditions. Some minerals dissolve and others will be precipitated. But overall, the porosity doesn't change significantly enough to change the effect of the injected simulation. So it doesn't change so much that the simulation changes. I know these are really small, but they're also small in the application. Basically examples of CO2 concentrations, pH change, illite precipitation, dissolution and reprecipitation of halite, change in porosity due to chemical dissolution, and then a mineral mass change, what's changing when during injection and post-injection period. So as noted previously, one of the primary goals of building the geologic model and running the numerical simulation is to reasonably simulate the area that will be affected by CO2 injection into the reservoir. And to simulate how far that CO2 might travel after injection ends. So we're looking for the stabilized plume extents. The example here is the extent of a stabilized plume as modeled, and knowing the extent of that stabilized plume is critical to establishing the facility area and applying an area of review around that facility. We need to know what lands will be affected by the plume in order to establish what lands will be in the facility and then what lands need to be monitored outside of it. Typical facility area will include the extent of the plume plus roughly about a half mile, whatever lands are needed to round out the facility plume affected area to legally describable tracts of land. That becomes the facility area, or the area in the white box here. The area of review is established around the facility area. This is typically going to be either a 1 mile around that facility area, or it can be determined by EPA, AOR, or area of review methodologies. I mentioned the area of review methodologies, and I'll touch briefly on them because they're relatively important in North Dakota here. That the EPA methods that the Class 6 federal rules allow assume hydrostatic equilibrium of the fluid in the injection reservoir. It expects that the fluid in the formation wants to stay in the formation, and the pressure above is balanced by the pressure below. And so they calculate a minimum pressure that would be required to move fluid from a injection reservoir to a USDW through an open conduit. Here in North Dakota, unfortunately, that doesn't work, basically because the Broom Creek is overpressurized in comparison to the USDW. If there was an open conduit, the brine could move from the Broom Creek into the USDW today before any injection was ever established. So applying an EPA method to the Broom Creek in North Dakota effectively results with an infinite AOR, which makes regulatory compliance infeasible, pretty much impossible. Because of the infeasibility of that methodology, an alternative approach was needed, and it was developed, and it's been termed as a risk-based AOR, or area of review. Without going into the nitty-gritty and the details of this, I've included a citation here if you really want to dive into the process. But basically, this method simulates what formation fluid would do migrating through a hypothetical leaky wellbore, and approximates or it incorporates a number of safety factors and assumptions in the calculation. Basically, we're in this calculation, we overestimate the hypothetical leaky wellbore, or the permeability of that wellbore. How open is that pathway? And then we also assume that there's no communication to thief zones, which we know are present above the reservoir here. So this is an example of a risk-based AOR that's been applied to a facility in North Dakota. If you note on the right-hand side here, this incremental flow as depicted is presented after a 20-year injection cycle. We're approximating less than 1/100th of a cubic meter of brine would move from the reservoir up into the USDW if that hypothetical leaky wellbore existed. And the methodology actually accounts for anything less than 1 cubic meter is essentially statistical noise. And it's unlikely to be true. And furthermore, if that leaky pathway did exist, these volumes over 20-year injection period would be probably on the order of lower than detectable limits, even if you were sampling the reservoir at the point of leak. So where this AOR has been used, it's basically been deemed appropriate that we apply an additional 1 mile buffer around the facility area as our AOR. And that's what's been applied on a number of examples in North Dakota. There is one facility that has used the EPA methodology as well. Any wellbore that would fall, so this is the corrective action section of the application. Any wellbore that would fall within or near an AOR is typically evaluated for possible corrective action needs. The well files for those wells get reviewed, and wellbore schematics get generated from that compiled information, from that compile information, and then that is evaluated for potential pathways for CO2 to migrate from the injection reservoir up into what would be a USDW. Note to date, no legacy wells have been within the storage facility area itself, though there have been some in the AOR. Possible corrective actions could include reentry or remedial replugging work if deemed necessary. We're beginning that wall of text style slides that I mentioned earlier, so my apologies for this. I'm going to start flying through these pretty quick and get to the end of this presentation momentarily. And again, please don't feel the need to read. I'll touch on the high points. But with respect to a casing and cementing program, all wells, both injectors and monitoring wells, being constructed are being done so with CO2 resistant casing and CO2 resistant cement across any potential injection reservoirs. This is being done in North Dakota because of regulations that require that they construct the wells to be designed for the life expectancy of the well, and they need to specifically account for the corrosiveness of the carbon dioxide stream and the type or grade of the cement in contact with the CO2. The injection well and storage operations. This section of the application includes the plan for completing injectors and the proposal for operating parameters during injection. When the actual applications for wells are received for these well permits, we review those well permits against what was presented in the storage facility application. We verify that they're being proposed at the same locations and to the approximate same depths, et cetera, as what was proposed or presented to us in the storage facility application. As far as operational parameters go, we review the operational parameters being presented here and review them against the parameters used during the numerical simulation. We wouldn't allow higher rates or pressures or volumes than those that they essentially simulated. We would no longer have an effective simulation. The testing and monitoring plan, it's important to note that this plan covers everything from pre-injection, baseline water and air sampling, to wellbore and pipeline corrosion monitoring and mechanical integrity testing, monitoring of injection operations, to the tracking of CO2 plume migration through periodic 3D seismic work. That 3D seismic is typically done before, during, and after injection phases. It also includes long-term monitoring. In a word, I've highlighted a single word on this slide, and that's excessive or extensive. I don't think I can quite call it exhaustive, as I'm sure there's always something else that could be tracked or tested or monitored, but it's pretty fair to say it's extensive. They do quite a bit of testing and monitoring before, during, and after one of these facilities. So the post-injection site care plan includes the operator's proposal for what operations need to be conducted when injection stops and the facility moves towards facility closure. All surface equipment not associated with long-term monitoring needs to be removed and properly abandoned. Disturbed lands need to be reclaimed as close as practical to the original condition. This is a mandatory minimum 10-year post-injection monitoring period where they're monitoring the CO2 plume and running 3D seismic monitoring where that plume is. And to achieve final closure site, the operator must be able to demonstrate the CO2 plume is stable, or effectively it will not move beyond the established facility boundaries. The facility closure plan here in North Dakota, Century Code allows for the state to assume title to the facility and the plume after closure. The facility closure plan identifies what monitoring resources are expected to be transferred to the state upon facility closure. We can only accept that responsibility for managing a closed storage facility. Post-closure monitoring and abandonment is funded via a per storage fee that's assessed against the facility. And there are numerous other requirements when it comes to the operator applying for and receiving a facility closure certificate. The emergency and remedial response plan and worker safety plans. Basically, this plan identifies events with potential to endanger the USDWs, people, or the environment, and what responses would be appropriate and what mitigation strategies would be appropriate to apply to manage those risks to the USDWs, people, underground sources of drinking water, people, or the environment. financial assurance and demonstration plan. This plan provides estimated costs for corrective action needs, injection, well plugging, post-injection site care period, facility closure period, emergency and remedial response. It also includes the operator's intent to supply that proposed financial assurance of that financial responsibility being met. That's the storage facility itself. Now, moving on, one more slide. My apologies. The geologic storage agreement is essentially a contract between the storage facility and the parties participating in the facility. The state reviews the provisions in the storage agreement, confirming the definitions are accurate, making sure the exhibits, which are typically ownership exhibits, and participation, who gets paid by the facility operation, allocation, how they get paid, and the term of that facility when the contract would end. We basically confirm that the storage agreement align with the storage facility application and that they don't conflict with North Dakota Century or administrative codes. Now that wraps up the storage facility review application itself. After reviewing all that, we can finally docket for hearing, like I indicated, and have that public comment period and public hearing. And after all that, potentially issue storage facility orders for the storage facility, the financial assurance, and the amalgamation. If I've got 2 more seconds, I'm going to rip through 2 more slides here. After the approval of the storage facility, the operator can finally apply for Class 6 injection wells. They can proceed with the construction or any corrective action required in the facility's order, or any permit stipulations as applied to the actual USC permitting. They can construct and test their injection wells and flow lines, and ultimately they can finally receive authorization to inject CO2. During storage facility operations, they can begin actual injection of CO2. They begin reporting requirements. They follow their testing and monitoring plan, and they prepare for a required 5-year review period in which we would review they would update their modeling, and we would review the facility AOR, financial assurance and amalgamation, to make sure everything is still in compliance with the facility as it was initially issued, or if we need to make changes to the facility. The regulatory responsibility during this operational phase includes regular USC field inspections. We receive production or injection reporting, evaluate testing and monitoring reports. We will have those hearings as needed for regular periodic reviews, and ultimately long-term, we do expect after closure that we would assume the long-term stewardship over the facility and after the facility's closure period. So with that, I'll open it to any questions.
Thank you so much, Richard, and a truly commendable effort to get thousands of pages of review material crammed into about a 25-minute presentation. So thank you. And I love the streamlined 400-page permits that you're currently reviewing. And lots of great questions here in the chat. I don't think we're going to have time to get to all of them in this format, but I may just hit on the first one that came in. And Richard, if you wouldn't mind, and folks on the line, we can keep this the meeting open for a little bit, and you guys can maybe just respond in the chat to some of those lingering questions that we won't have a chance to get to in this time frame. But the one that came in first that I'd like to touch on is if you could briefly describe how proprietary and non-proprietary information is segregated in those Class 6 applications. You know, how much of that 400 or 500 pages is actually available to the public?
So that entire application, everything that's submitted, because we're a state agency in North Dakota, it is fully open to public information. Freedom of Information Act could get everything the state has essentially. But we actually post that storage application on our webpage. The whole application, all the appendices, all the information do get posted to our webpage for review. So it's fully available to the public during that public comment period. And many people do review it and provide comment or feedback based on information in the application. So in the application that's submitted to North Dakota for the purposes of reviewing that application, it's entirely public.
And yeah, I do recall actually seeing those available on your guys' website. Got really helpful links to the permit applications, to the different orders. So really great, just public resource for folks who want to dive into that 1,000 pages of the first permit there. We just wanted a quick last question. I think I won't still get to a couple more, but there was one that wanted to know about the numerical model software package that you use. Did you have a specific one that you wanted to comment on that's used by North Dakota?
Yeah, so to date, the numerical simulation software that we've used and that the entities that have submitted applications have used has been GEM. It's a CMG product, computer modeling group, and it's the GEM software that they use to numerically simulate CO2 injection into the modeled reservoir. So that is what has been used to date, and that is what we've. I believe that's capable of taking a number of different modeling results packages and incorporating them. But that is what we've used to date. That is what we have access to at this point. We do point operators in that direction, or at least when they're coming to us originally, we make them aware that that's what we're used to using. In the event that an operator wanted to use something else, we may have to either determine a way to acquire said package or have them provide said package to us so we could evaluate accordingly, because we do run through those numerical simulations ourselves, and we can adjust or tweak parameters to see how that affects the numerical simulation beyond what the operator originally submits. So.
Well, it's really helpful to see those images and those models, and that really sort of helped to land it. I thought that was fascinating to see the whole Broom Creek formation there. But thank you again for your time. Like I said, we can kind of continue this discussion in the chat. I think we're going to go ahead and wrap up for today. Really want to thank you, Richard. Want to thank all of our presenters, our moderators, panelists, everybody for participating. We will be continuing this discussion tomorrow at 8:30 a.m. Frank Paskvan will be your MC for the day. We have the agenda here up on the screen. Again, we'll be really looking at some specific project examples from around the globe, and then starting to talk to some of our local experts here in Alaska. So we really hope that you can join us for this and for the Governor's Sustainable Energy Conference coming up at the end of May. Hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and thanks again for staying tuned. Have a good evening or afternoon.